That last remark, delivered with such quiet certainty, struck a nerve. Marcus prided himself on his intelligence, a fact he rarely let show beneath his brute exterior. He stared at her, genuinely thrown off balance. His usual tactics were failing. He couldn't intimidate her. He couldn't scare her. And now she was subtly dissecting his character. The unlikely arrangement between Alara Vance and Marcus Thorne had solidified. A strange, unspoken truce that baffled the students of Northwood High. Marcus, still, the marauder in appearance, was now quietly performing acts of unexpected kindness, his bullying largely replaced by grudging compliance. He resented Alara's control, yet a flicker of curiosity, a nascent sense of something akin to satisfaction, had begun to stir within him. You've seen the surface changes, but now you are about to delve deeper into the troubled past that forged Marcus Thorne, revealing the painful roots of his anger and isolation. Northwood High wasn't just a school, it was a kingdom. And like any kingdom, it had its undisputed ruler. His name was Marcus Thorne, though everyone, from the terrified freshmen to the jaded seniors, knew him simply as the Marauder. He wasn't the biggest kid in school, not by a long shot, but his presence was a gravitational pull of fear. It wasn't just his size, it was the cold, calculating glint in his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to broaden when he walked, and the chilling silence that fell over any conversation when he entered a room. His reputation preceded him, a dark cloud that hung over every hallway, every classroom, and most notably, the cafeteria. Alara, with her quiet perceptiveness, continued to observe Marcus. She saw the dark circles under his eyes that never seemed to fade, the way he sometimes flinched at sudden loud noises, and the almost desperate protectiveness he showed towards his grandmother's secret. She knew there was more to his story than just poverty and illness. His aggression, his need for control, felt too deeply ingrained, too primal, to be solely explained by his current circumstances. She suspected a deeper trauma, an older wound that festered beneath his hardened exterior. You could feel it the moment you stepped through the school's main doors. A subtle tension, a collective holding of breath. Students moved with a practiced caution, their eyes scanning, always aware of where Marcus might be. If he was in the hallway, you'd instinctively hug the lockers, trying to become invisible. If he was in your class, you'd keep your head down, hoping his gaze wouldn't land on you. And in the cafeteria, that vast, echoing space of clattering trays and nervous chatter, there was one table that remained perpetually empty, a silent testament to his reign. It was a large, worn wooden table in the corner, bathed in the weak afternoon light filtering through the high windows. No one dared sit near it, let alone at it, not if they valued their peace, their lunch money, or their dignity. One afternoon, Alara was in the school library, working on a project, when she overheard a hushed conversation between two older teachers, Mrs. Davison and Mr. Henderson. They were speaking in low tones, their faces etched with concern. Marcus didn't need to say much. A single, piercing stare was usually enough to make someone drop their tray, stammer an apology, or simply flee. His bullying wasn't always physical. Often, it was a psychological warfare, a slow erosion of confidence, a public humiliation that left its victims feeling utterly exposed and alone. He had a knack for finding weaknesses, for exploiting insecurities, and for making sure everyone knew who was in charge. You'd see kids walk past that empty table, their eyes fixed straight ahead, a palpable sense of relief washing over them once they were safely on the other side of the room. It was an unspoken rule, a fundamental law of Northwood High: stay away from the marauder. "Did you see Marcus Thorne today?" Mrs. Davison whispered. "He looks exhausted. It's getting worse, isn't it?" The teachers, for their part, seemed to operate under a similar unspoken agreement. They saw, but they didn't always intervene. Marcus was a problem, a force of nature, and confronting him often seemed to cause more trouble than it was worth. He wasn't failing classes. He wasn't openly defiant in front of adults, but his influence over the student body was absolute. It was a strange, uneasy truce, where the adults ceded a certain territory to the bully, hoping to maintain a semblance of order. It was like a medieval kingdom where the king had to tolerate a particularly troublesome baron, just to keep the peace. Mr. Henderson sighed, shaking his head. "It is. Ever since his mother, well, you know, and his father, he's never really been in the picture. It's just him and his grandmother now. And she's not doing well. Then came Alara Vance. Illyra froze, her pencil hovering over her notebook. His mother. The missing piece. She had never heard anyone mention Marcus's parents. He always seemed to exist in a vacuum, a self-created island of intimidation. She arrived mid-semester, a transfer student from a small rural town that no one at Northwood had ever heard of. She was quiet, almost ethereal, with eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her without betraying a single emotion. Her clothes were simple, well-worn but clean, hinting at a life that was perhaps less privileged than many of Northwood's students. She carried herself with an unassuming grace, a quiet confidence that wasn't defiance, but simply a lack of fear. She was an anomaly, a glitch in the carefully constructed ecosystem of Northwood High. "It's a shame," Mrs. Hythe Davison continued, her voice soft with pity. "He was such a bright kid, once, before everything, always reading, always quiet. Then his mother got sick, really sick, and he just changed, like he had to become someone else to survive." Her first day was like any other transfer student's, a flurry of introductions, a scramble to find classes, and the inevitable awkwardness of being the new kid. But it was during lunch, on that very first day, that Alara Vance unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, shattered the unspoken rule of Northwood High. Mr. Henderson nodded grimly, and the father, leaving them like that, just packed up and left when things got tough. Marcus was barely 10. That kind of abandonment, it leaves scars. The cafeteria was a cacophony of sounds: laughter, gossip, the scraping of chairs, the clatter of cutlery. Marcus Thorne sat at his usual table, alone, as always. His presence created a silent void around him, a force field of intimidation. Students navigated wide arcs to avoid even brushing past his corner. He was eating slowly, deliberately, his gaze sweeping the room, daring anyone to meet his eyes. No one did. Alara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The pieces clicked into place with a chilling clarity. His mother's illness, his father's abandonment, the crushing responsibility of caring for his grandmother at such a young age. This was the crucible that had forged the marauder. His aggression wasn't just a shield, it was a desperate, misguided attempt to control a world that had spiraled out of his control. It was a roar born from profound pain and betrayal. It's like discovering that the monster under your bed is actually just a scared, lonely child. Until Alara, a common historical fact, often explored in developmental psychology, is that children who experience significant trauma, neglect, or abandonment in their formative years often develop maladaptive coping mechanisms, including aggression, a need for control, or emotional detachment, as a way to protect themselves from further pain. Marcus's story, tragically, fit this pattern perfectly. She walked into the cafeteria, tray in hand, her eyes calmly surveying the crowded room. She didn't seem to notice the subtle shifts in conversation, the sudden glances, the nervous energy that permeated the space. Or perhaps she did, and simply didn't care. Her gaze drifted over the packed tables, the small, nervous groups, and then, inexplicably, landed on the empty table in the corner. Marcus's table. Alara continued to listen, her heart heavy. They spoke of how Marcus had once been a quiet, studious child, how he loved to read, how he was surprisingly gentle. But as his mother's illness progressed, as his father vanished, and as the financial burdens mounted, he had retreated, building walls, becoming increasingly isolated and angry. The bullying wasn't about power for power's sake. It was about survival, about creating a perimeter of fear to keep others away, to prevent anyone from seeing his vulnerability, his shame, his profound loneliness. A collective gasp, almost imperceptible, rippled through the room. Heads turned, whispers erupted, then died down to a stunned silence. Every eye was on Alara. She walked straight towards that table, her steps even and unhurried. She didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. She simply placed her tray down on the polished wood, directly opposite Marcus, and slid onto the bench. The realization hit Alara with a powerful force. Marcus wasn't just a bully. He was a victim of circumstance, of abandonment, of a life that had dealt him a cruel hand. His rage was a desperate cry for help, a distorted echo of his own pain. The quiet observations she had made, the children's book in the library, the subtle protectiveness during the fire drill, the flinch at a raised voice, the dilapidated house, all now made terrifying sense. They were glimpses into the wounded soul beneath the marauder's facade. Marcus Thorne, the marauder, froze, his fork, halfway to his mouth, stopped. His eyes, usually cold and unreadable, widened almost imperceptibly. He stared at her, a mixture of disbelief and simmering rage beginning to cloud his features. No one had ever dared, not once, in all his years at Northwood. And now, this quiet, unassuming girl, this new girl, had not only dared, but had done so with an almost casual indifference, as if sitting at his table was the most natural thing in the world. The silence in the cafeteria was absolute, thick enough to cut with a knife. Every student held their breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion, but Alara Vance simply picked up her fork and began to eat her lunch. A lesser-known detail about the impact of chronic illness on families, especially in poverty, is the immense pressure it places on the youngest members. Children often take on adult responsibilities, sacrificing their own childhoods and emotional well-being to care for sick parents or grandparents. Marcus, at a tender age, had been forced into this role, robbed of his innocence and burdened with an unbearable weight. His anger was a manifestation of that stolen childhood, that crushing responsibility. The silence in the Northwood High cafeteria was a physical entity, pressing down on every student, every clattering tray, every nervous breath. All eyes were fixed on Alara Vance, the new girl, who had just committed the ultimate social transgression. She had sat at Marcus Thorne's table. Marcus, the marauder, remained frozen, his fork suspended in mid-air, his gaze locked on Alara. His jaw was tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. No one had ever challenged his unspoken dominion over that corner of the room. Not a single soul. And now, this quiet, unassuming girl, with her simple clothes and calm demeanor, had not only invaded his space, but was now, incredibly, eating her lunch. Alara felt a surge of something new towards Marcus, not just understanding, but a profound empathy. He wasn't just someone she needed to control, he was someone who needed help, even if he didn't know how to ask for it. Her leverage, the secret of his grandmother, now felt less like a weapon and more like a fragile thread connecting them. A thread she had to handle with immense care. Alara, seemingly oblivious to the collective held breath of the entire student body, took a small bite of her sandwich. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. She chewed slowly, her eyes occasionally flicking up to meet Marcus's furious stare. But without a trace of fear or even acknowledgement of his anger, it was as if she saw him not as the terrifying marauder, but simply as another person sharing a table. This infuriated Marcus more than any direct challenge ever could. It was an insult by omission, a dismissal of his power. The next time Alara sat with Marcus at lunch, her gaze held a new depth. She didn't mention what she had overheard. She simply looked at him, and for the first time, Marcus seemed to sense a change in her. Her usual calm was still there, but now it was infused with something softer, something that made him subtly uneasy, as if she had seen too much. He slowly lowered his fork, placing it with a soft clink on his tray. The sound echoed in the unnerving silence. "What do you think you're doing?" Marcus's voice was a low growl, a rumble that usually sent shivers down spines. It was designed to intimidate, to make the recipient shrink, to apologize profusely. He scowled, trying to reassert his usual dominance. "What are you looking at?" "Vance?" Alara looked up, her gaze steady. "Eating lunch," she replied, her voice soft but clear, utterly devoid of tremor. She gestured vaguely at her tray. "It's lunchtime, isn't it?" Alara took a bite of her sandwich. "You," she replied, simply, "you look tired. Marcus, are you getting enough sleep?" A collective gasp rippled through the cafeteria again. Quickly stifled, students exchanged wide-eyed glances. No one had ever spoken to Marcus Thorne like that. No one had ever responded to his intimidation with such simple, unyielding logic. It was like watching a small bird calmly peck at a lion's paw. He flinched, his eyes narrowing. It was an innocuous question, but it hit too close to home. It spoke of a vulnerability he couldn't afford to show. "None of your business," he muttered, looking away. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing to slits. "This table," he enunciated slowly, each word dripping with menace, "is my table. You don't sit here." "It is, if it's affecting your grades," Alara said, her voice gentle. "You're smart. Marcus, you just don't apply yourself. And you could use that to help yourself, to help your grandmother. Alara took another bite of her sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. It's an empty table, she said, after swallowing. And the rest of the cafeteria is full. Besides, she added, her eyes briefly flicking around the room, no one else seems to want to sit here. So, it's available. Her words, linking his intelligence to his grandmother's well-being, resonated with an unexpected power. He looked back at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He still resented her control, but her understanding, her quiet acknowledgement of his burden, was a new, unsettling sensation. The sheer audacity of her calm reasoning was disarming. Marcus was used to fear, to tears, to immediate capitulation. He was used to people scrambling away from him. He was not used to someone treating his unspoken rules as mere suggestions. Easily dismissed, his face began to flush, a dark red creeping up his neck. Historians still debate the long-term psychological effects of childhood trauma and abandonment on individuals in various historical contexts. While modern psychology offers frameworks for understanding these impacts, the specific societal and cultural factors of different eras would have shaped how such trauma manifested and was dealt with. This remains an open academic question. How did medieval or early modern societies recognize and address the deep emotional wounds that Marcus experienced? "Get out!" he snarled, pushing his tray forward slightly, a clear threat. "Now, before I make you." Alara knew that forcing him to perform acts of kindness was only a temporary solution. To truly change, Marcus needed to confront his own pain, to heal the old wounds, and that was a journey he had to embark on himself. But she could, perhaps, provide the first few steps, the quiet guidance he desperately needed, even if he fought her every inch of the way. Alara finally put her sandwich down. She looked at him, not with defiance, but with a quiet, almost curious intensity. "You won't make me," she stated, simply. "I'm not bothering you. I'm just eating my lunch. If you don't like it, you can move." As the days continued, Alara subtly began to shift her commands. They were less about rectifying past wrongs and more about encouraging Marcus to engage positively. To use his formidable presence for good, she'd suggest he help a struggling student with a heavy load of books, or quietly intervene when another bully was picking on someone. Each time, he'd grumble, he'd resist, but the leash of his secret, and now, perhaps, a nascent, unacknowledged desire for something different, compelled him to obey. The cafeteria exploded in a flurry of hushed whispers. Did she just tell Marcus Thorne to move the marauder? This new girl was either incredibly brave, incredibly foolish, or completely insane. A few students actually dropped their jaws. Even the teachers, who had been pretending to not notice the unfolding drama, subtly shifted their weight, their eyes darting towards the corner. He was still the marauder to everyone else, but to Alara, he was Marcus, a boy burdened by a tragic past, desperately trying to survive in a world that had seemingly abandoned him. The stage was set for a deeper transformation, a confrontation with his own internal demons, and the potential for a redemption he never thought possible. But a new shadow was about to fall over Northwood High, a threat that would force Marcus and Alara into an uneasy alliance, pushing their strange relationship to its ultimate test. Marcus's hand clenched into a fist on the table, his knuckles white. He looked like he was about to erupt, to unleash the full force of his infamous rage. He had never been so openly defied, so casually dismissed. The humiliation was palpable, burning in his chest. He stood up abruptly, scraping the bench loudly across the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. You've seen the profound, painful truth behind Marcus Thorne's aggression, the echoes of a troubled past that had forged. The marauder, Alara Vance, armed with this understanding, had begun to subtly reshape his behavior, forcing him into reluctant acts of kindness. But compliance born of coercion is a fragile thing, and Marcus, chafing under Alara's quiet control, was about to test the chains that bound him. He resented her power, hated the feeling of being manipulated, and a deep-seated need to reclaim his autonomy began to fester within him. You find yourself in a tense, watchful atmosphere at Northwood High, as if the entire school is holding its breath, waiting for Marcus to snap. Every student flinched, expecting violence, but Alara didn't flinch. She merely looked up at him, her expression unchanged. The small, almost imperceptible acts of kindness Marcus had been performing, under Ilara's quiet direction, had begun to chip away at his image. Students were still wary, but the pure, unadulterated fear he once commanded was slowly dissipating. He heard whispers now, not just of the marauder, but of Marcus Thorne, sometimes even accompanied by a confused, "Did he just help that kid?" This erosion of his carefully constructed persona infuriated him. He had built that wall of fear for a reason, to protect himself, to keep the world at bay. And Ilara, with her quiet demands, was tearing it down, brick by painful brick. Marcus loomed over her, his shadow falling across her small frame. "You think you're tough? New girl," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can just waltz in here and disrespect me?" He started to feel a dangerous surge of defiance. He was Marcus Thorne. He didn't take orders from anyone, especially not from a quiet, seemingly powerless girl. The humiliation of his secret being known, of being controlled by it, gnawed at him. He needed to prove, to himself and to everyone else, that he was still in charge, that he was still the marauder. He needed to break free. Ilara picked up a potato chip from her tray, crunching it softly. "I'm not trying to be tough," she replied, her voice still calm. "And I'm not disrespecting you. I'm just sitting where there's an empty seat." She met his furious gaze directly. "Are you going to hit me, Marcus?" His first attempt to test Ilara's control came subtly. Ilara had quietly suggested he help a new student, Liam, who was struggling to carry a stack of heavy textbooks to the library. Marcus had grumbled, but complied, walking alongside Liam, his presence enough to clear a path through the crowded hallway. Later that day, Ilara found him by the lockers. The question hung in the air, stark and unexpected. It wasn't accusatory, not challenging in a taunting way, but simply a direct, almost innocent inquiry. It stripped away his usual theatrics, his psychological games, and forced him to confront the raw, ugly truth of his bullying. He was used to people being afraid of his violence, but not to someone calmly asking if he intended to use it. Liam said thank you, Ilara said, her voice calm. Marcus faltered. He stared at her, his rage momentarily eclipsed by a flicker of something else. Confusion, perhaps, or a strange, unsettling recognition. He had never been asked that question so directly, so calmly. He had never been forced to articulate his intent in such a stark manner. The cafeteria remained silent, every eye glued to the standoff. Marcus scoffed. "Don't care." He leaned against the locker, trying to project indifference, but his eyes were narrowed, watching her. "You think you can just tell me what to do? Vance? You think you've got me all figured out?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. His fist slowly unclenched. The anger was still there, a simmering cauldron in his gut, but the immediate, explosive reaction he was known for simply didn't come. He looked around the room, at the sea of terrified, expectant faces, then back at Ilara, who was now calmly reaching for another chip. Ilara met his gaze. "I think you're helping people, Marcus," she replied, simply, even when you don't want to admit it, with a frustrated growl that was more a strangled sound of defeat than a roar. Marcus Thorne slammed his hand down on the table, making the trays jump. He didn't hit Ilara. He didn't even touch her. He just slammed his hand down, then spun on his heel and stormed out of the cafeteria, leaving behind a stunned silence and an empty seat at his table. "I'm not helping anyone," he snarled, pushing off the locker. "And I'm not doing any more of your little favors. You can't make me." His voice was low, dangerous, a clear challenge. He was testing her, pushing back, seeing if her quiet power had limits. The students exchanged bewildered glances. Marcus Thorne, the marauder, had just been outmaneuvered by the new girl without a single punch thrown. It was unprecedented. The cafeteria slowly erupted into a buzz of excited, disbelieving chatter. Ilara Vance, meanwhile, calmly resumed eating her lunch, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. The shadow of Northwood High had just encountered something it couldn't quite comprehend. Ilara didn't flinch. She simply looked at him, her eyes holding that deep, knowing understanding. "Your grandmother, Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but it cut through his defiance like a knife. Did you remember to pick up her prescription today? She needs it, doesn't she? The cafeteria, still buzzing with a disbelieving hum, slowly returned to its chaotic rhythm. But the air was different now, charged with a new kind of energy. Marcus Thorne, the marauder, had retreated, leaving behind a silence that spoke volumes. He hadn't just walked away, he had been driven away, not by force, but by the quiet, unyielding presence of Alara Vance. You could feel the shift in the school's unspoken hierarchy, a tremor beneath the surface of Northwood High. Marcus froze. His face went pale. He had completely forgotten. The sheer weight of his responsibilities, combined with his simmering resentment, had made him overlook the one thing he couldn't afford to neglect. Alara's words were not just a reminder, they were a chilling demonstration of her continued knowledge, her unwavering grip on his most vulnerable point. He felt the cold dread creep back into his stomach. She knew. She always knew. Marcus, however, was not one to accept defeat, especially not from a new girl, a nobody. His retreat from the cafeteria was a temporary tactical withdrawal, not a surrender. The humiliation burned in his gut, a raw, festering wound. He spent the rest of the day simmering, his mind replaying the scene, the calm eyes of Alara Vance, her infuriatingly logical responses. He needed to reassert his dominance, to remind everyone, and himself, who he was. The marauder. He glared at her, a mixture of fury and desperate helplessness in his eyes. He wanted to lash out, to scream, to deny. But the image of his frail grandmother, dependent on him, flashed in his mind. He was trapped. The next day, the tension in Northwood High was palpable. Students braced themselves, knowing that Marcus would retaliate. His anger was a force of nature, and Alara Vance had poked the bear. They expected a public spectacle, a brutal display of power designed to put the new girl, and anyone else who dared to defy him, firmly back in their place. You could almost hear the collective intake of breath as the first bell rang, signaling the start of another day under Marcus's looming shadow. "Fine," he ground out, his voice thick with defeat. He spun on his heel and strode away, leaving Alara standing calmly by the lockers. His attempt to break free had failed, and Alara had subtly, but powerfully, reinforced her control. It was like a medieval knight trying to break free of invisible chains, only to find them tightening with every struggle. Marcus found Alara during the first break, in the crowded hallway between classes. He cornered her against a locker, his body language radiating menace. Students quickly formed a wide circle around them, pretending not to watch, but every eye was glued to the confrontation. A common historical fact, often explored in psychological studies of power and control, is that when an individual's core vulnerabilities are known and subtly leveraged, their ability to resist can be severely diminished. Marcus's grandmother was his Achilles heel, and Alara, by gently reminding him of this, was able to maintain her influence without resorting to overt threats or violence. "You think you're clever, don't you, new girl?" Marcus sneered, his voice low and dangerous, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Think you can just walk in here and make a fool out of me?" His resentment, however, didn't vanish. It festered, leading to a more aggressive attempt to reassert his dominance. A few days later, during lunch, Marcus deliberately bumped into a smaller, timid student named Leo, sending his tray crashing to the floor, scattering food everywhere. Leo froze, his eyes wide with terror, expecting the usual barrage of insults. The cafeteria fell silent, all eyes on Marcus, waiting for the marauder to unleash his fury. Alara looked at him, her expression unreadable. She wasn't shrinking, not flinching. "I didn't make a fool out of you, Marcus," she said, her voice calm, almost conversational. "You did that yourself. When you stormed out." Marcus smirked, a cruel glint in his eyes. He looked directly at Alara, who was sitting at their table, her gaze steady. This was his defiance. This was his way of saying, "You don't control me." A ripple of nervous gasps went through the onlookers. Her directness was astonishing. Marcus's face darkened. "You're going to regret that," he hissed, leaning closer, his eyes blazing. "You don't know who you're messing with." Alara slowly put down her sandwich. She didn't say a word. She simply stood up and walked towards Marcus and Leo. The marauder's smirk faltered as she approached, her quiet presence radiating an unnerving calm. "I think I have a pretty good idea," Alara replied, her gaze steady. "You're Marcus Thorne. You like to scare people. You like to make them feel small, but you don't actually like to hit girls. Do you? Not unless you're really, really desperate." She stopped beside Leo, who was trembling, on the verge of tears. She then looked at Marcus, her eyes holding a profound disappointment, not anger. "Marcus," she said, her voice soft, but it cut through the silence like a razor. "That was unnecessary and cruel." Marcus froze. The words hit him with an unexpected precision. It wasn't just that she wasn't afraid, it was that she seemed to see him, to understand something about him that he carefully kept hidden. He was known for his intimidation, his verbal cruelty, his ability to break people down psychologically. Physical violence, especially against girls, was a line he rarely crossed, not because of morality, but because it was messy, attracted unwanted attention from authorities, and often felt beneath him. Alara had just called him out on his unspoken code, exposing a subtle weakness in his carefully constructed persona. Marcus bristled. "He was in my way," he snarled, trying to sound intimidating, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. He felt a strange unease under her gaze, a feeling of being judged, not by fear, but by a quiet moral authority. His eyes narrowed, a different kind of anger now simmering beneath the surface, a mix of fury and a strange, unsettling curiosity. "You think you know me?" he scoffed, trying to regain control. "You don't know anything about me." Alara knelt down beside Leo, helping him gather his scattered food, ignoring Marcus completely for a moment. She looked at Leo, her voice gentle. "Are you okay?" "Leo? Maybe not everything," Alara conceded, her voice still calm. "But enough to know you're not as tough as you pretend to be. And you're certainly not as stupid as you act." Leo nodded, still trembling. He pushed off the locker, creating some distance. "This isn't over, Vance," he snarled, his voice lacking its usual conviction. "You'll learn." Alara then stood up and turned back to Marcus. Her voice was still quiet, but there was a steel edge to it now. "You're going to clean this up. Marcus," she commanded, her eyes unwavering. "Every last bit. And then you're going to get Leo a new lunch." "Maybe," Alara said simply. "Or maybe you will." Marcus's jaw dropped. Clean it up. Get a new lunch. Publicly. The humiliation was unbearable. "No," he roared, his old defiance flaring. "I'm not doing that. You can't make me." Marcus glared at her for another long moment, then spun around and pushed his way through the stunned crowd, leaving Alara standing calmly by the lockers. The students slowly dispersed, exchanging bewildered whispers. The marauder had roared, but his roar had been met with a quiet, unshakable calm, and for the first time, it seemed to have lost its power. Alara simply raised an eyebrow, a silent, knowing look that spoke volumes. She didn't need to mention his grandmother. The message was clear. Her gaze was unyielding, her resolve absolute. She was calling his bluff, forcing him to choose between his pride and his secret. Over the next few days, Marcus's attempts to reassert his dominance became more frequent and more desperate. He'd try to trip Alara in the hallway, but she'd step over his outstretched foot with uncanny grace. He'd accidentally bump into her, trying to make her drop her books, but she'd brace herself, her grip firm. He'd try to steal her lunch money, but she'd simply look at him with that calm, knowing gaze, and he'd find himself inexplicably unable to complete the act, a strange paralysis seizing his hand. It was as if her quiet presence created an invisible shield, deflecting his aggression without effort. He stood there, frozen, his face a contorted mask of fury and shame. He looked around the cafeteria, at the hundreds of eyes fixed on him, waiting. He saw the anticipation, the nervous excitement. He wanted to lash out, to smash something, to make them all regret watching. But he also saw Alara's unwavering gaze, a silent, powerful force that held him captive. A common historical fact, often overlooked in the study of bullying dynamics, is that bullies often operate within a very specific set of learned behaviors and expectations. When a victim deviates from these expected reactions, fear, submission, anger, the bully's established routine is disrupted, leaving them disoriented and forcing them to adapt or retreat. Alara, by simply refusing to play the victim, was dismantling Marcus's entire framework. It was like trying to use a remote control on a TV that suddenly decided it preferred to be a toaster. A lesser-known detail about the psychology of defiance in coercive relationships is that individuals will often test the boundaries of control, pushing back to see if the leverage is real or if the controller will falter. Ilara's response, by calmly escalating her demands and reinforcing her control without resorting to anger or physical force, demonstrated the unwavering nature of her power over Marcus. It's like a medieval game of chicken, but with emotional stakes and no clear winner until one person blinks. Marcus's frustration grew. He resorted to more childish tactics, trying to spread rumors about Ilara or making snide comments about her clothes. But even these attempts fell flat. Ilara never reacted. She never defended herself. She just continued to move through Northwood High with her quiet dignity, completely unaffected by his petty attempts at sabotage. Her indifference was a far more potent weapon than any counterattack. With a guttural growl of utter defeat, Marcus Thorne slowly, reluctantly, knelt down. His movements were stiff, his face burning with humiliation. He began to pick up the scattered food, his large hands clumsy, his pride shattered. The cafeteria erupted in a stunned murmur. The marauder was cleaning up a mess he had made. The marauder was obeying. One day, Marcus decided to escalate. He waited for Ilara after school, near the bike racks. He had a small group of his usual hangers-on with him, snickering nervously, sensing a major confrontation. He cleaned up every last bit, his face a thundercloud. Then, with a furious glare at Ilara, he stalked off to the lunch line, bought Leo a new lunch, and brought it back, placing it on the table with a loud thud. He didn't say another word, just turned and stormed back to his own table, collapsing onto the bench, avoiding Ilara's gaze. Going somewhere, Vance? Marcus sneered, blocking her path. Ilara simply offered Leo a small, reassuring smile, then returned to her own lunch, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over her. Marcus had tested the chains, and they had held. In fact, they had tightened. His defiance had been met with an unyielding resolve that left him more deeply bound than before. Ilara stopped, her hand on the handlebars of her worn bicycle. "Home," she replied. "Unless you have a reason to stop me." From that day forward, Marcus's attempts to break free became less frequent and less aggressive. He still grumbled. He still resented Ilara's control. But he also understood, on a deeper level, that she held all the cards. His anger slowly began to morph into a grudging acceptance, and even, at times, a strange, unsettling curiosity about this girl, who saw through his facade and held his deepest secret. "Maybe I do," Marcus said, trying to sound menacing. "Maybe I want to teach you a lesson about who runs this school." He took a step closer, invading her personal space. Historians still debate the long-term effectiveness of non-punitive, leverage-based approaches to behavioral change, particularly in contexts where individuals are resistant to traditional authority. While positive reinforcement and empathetic understanding are often seen as ideal, Ilara's method, while coercive, proved remarkably effective in forcing Marcus to confront his own actions and begin a path of transformation. This remains an open academic question. When is coercion, even for a good outcome, ethically justifiable, and what are its lasting psychological impacts? Ilara didn't back down. She simply looked at him, her eyes holding a depth that seemed to pierce through his bravado. "What kind of lesson, Marcus?" she asked, her voice still soft. "The kind where you try to make someone feel bad because you feel bad yourself. Is that the lesson?" Ilara, for her part, continued to use her leverage with quiet precision. Her commands were no longer just about stopping his bullying. They were about encouraging him to engage positively with the school community, to use his strength for good. She'd suggest he help a struggling teacher move boxes, or quietly intervene when a younger student was being picked on by other bullies. Marcus, still the intimidating presence, was slowly, unwillingly, becoming a quiet force for good, his formidable energy being subtly redirected. Marcus flinched. The words were too close, too accurate. His usual bluster died in his throat. He looked away, his gaze flickering to his friends, who suddenly seemed very interested in their shoes. Ilara had, once again, bypassed his defenses and gone straight for the hidden wound. He was still the marauder to everyone else, but to Ilara, he was Marcus, a boy slowly, painfully, shedding the layers of anger and fear that had defined him. The stage was now set for a new shadow to fall over Northwood High, a threat that would force Marcus and Alara into an uneasy, unspoken alliance, pushing their strange relationship to its ultimate test, and perhaps, truly, beginning his path to redemption. A lesser-known detail about bullies is that their aggression often stems from their own insecurities, anxieties, or difficult home lives. They externalize their pain, projecting it onto others to regain a sense of control they lack in their own lives. Alara, with her quiet perceptiveness, seemed to instinctively understand this, bypassing his tough exterior to touch upon the vulnerable core beneath. It's like she had X-ray vision for emotional baggage. You've witnessed Marcus Thorne's desperate attempts to break free from Alara Vance's quiet control, and how each challenge only tightened the invisible chains that bound him. His resentment still simmered, a low, constant burn. But something new was beginning to stir within him, a subtle shift born from forced compliance. Now, you are about to see the first true glimmer of humanity in the Marauder. A moment of unexpected kindness that catches Alara's keen eye and hints at a potential for redemption Marcus himself never imagined. You find yourself in the familiar, bustling hallways of Northwood High, but the atmosphere around Marcus feels subtly different, less oppressive, more complicated. Marcus stood there, momentarily speechless, his carefully constructed image crumbling under Alara's calm scrutiny. He wanted to lash out, to scream, to hit something, but her words had disarmed him, leaving him exposed. He felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation, not fear, but a profound discomfort, a sense of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long time. The forced acts of kindness, initially performed with a scowl and a muttered curse, had become almost routine for Marcus. He still hated them, hated the feeling of being Alara's puppet, but the constant defiance was exhausting. His energy, once solely focused on intimidation, was now being subtly redirected. He found himself picking up dropped books, holding doors open, or even, on occasion, offering a gruff, unsolicited piece of advice to a struggling freshman. These were not acts of genuine altruism, not yet, but they were actions that contradicted his established persona, slowly eroding the foundations of the Marauder. He took a step back, then another. His friends shuffled awkwardly, sensing the unexpected shift in dynamic. "Just get out of here, Vance," Marcus muttered, his voice barely audible, devoid of its usual power. He turned away, walking quickly, his friends scrambling to follow him, leaving Alara standing alone with her bicycle. One chilly afternoon, as students were leaving school, a sudden, heavy downpour erupted, catching everyone by surprise. The main entrance became a chaotic bottleneck as students scrambled for cover or waited for rides. A small, timid girl, perhaps a 7th grader, stood near the edge of the crowd, visibly distressed. She had dropped her backpack, and its contents, books, pencils, a small, brightly colored drawing, had spilled onto the wet pavement. She was on the verge of tears, overwhelmed by the rain and the jostling crowd, desperately trying to gather her belongings. No one seemed to notice her. Caught up in their own rush to escape the deluge, the Marauder had roared, but his roar had been met with a quiet, knowing gaze that saw beyond the facade. And in that moment, something shifted at Northwood High. The fear hadn't vanished entirely, but a tiny crack had appeared in Marcus Thorne's impenetrable armor. A crack that only Alara Vance seemed capable of finding. The stage was set for a deeper understanding, a revelation that would explain the Marauder's rage, and perhaps begin to unravel his reign. Except Marcus. The air in Northwood High had indeed shifted. Marcus Thorne still cast a long shadow, but it was no longer absolute. The quiet defiance of Alara Vance had chipped away at his carefully constructed facade, leaving him visibly flustered, his usual tactics proving ineffective. The students, while still wary, now watched Alara with a mixture of awe and nervous curiosity. They expected her to be crushed, to break, but she remained an unyielding, calm presence. You could almost feel the collective bewilderment, the silent questions hanging in the air. Who is this girl? And what is she doing to the Marauder? He was standing under the meager shelter of an overhang, waiting for his bus, his usual scowl firmly in place. His eyes, however, were scanning the chaos, a habit born from his need to control his environment. His gaze landed on the struggling girl, Ilara, who was also waiting nearby, subtly watched him. She expected him to ignore her, or perhaps even offer a sneering comment. Ilara, for her part, didn't seem to revel in her newfound notoriety. She continued to move through the school with the same quiet grace, her eyes observant, taking everything in. She wasn't trying to provoke Marcus. She was simply existing, unburdened by the fear that paralyzed everyone else. But beneath her calm exterior, a subtle shift was occurring. Her encounters with Marcus, particularly the way his anger seemed to falter when confronted with her quiet perceptiveness, had piqued her interest. She wasn't just defending herself, she was beginning to study him. But he didn't. She started to notice things that others missed, subtle inconsistencies in Marcus's behavior that contradicted his fearsome persona. For instance, while he might shove a smaller kid's books to the floor, he would rarely, if ever, actually kick them. He'd snatch lunch money, but he never seemed to spend it on himself, nor did he flaunt it. His bullying was often about control, about making others feel small, but it lacked the pure, malicious joy that some bullies exhibited. It was almost as if he was performing a role, a terrifying act he felt compelled to play. You could almost see Ilara's mind working, piecing together these small, disparate observations, like a detective gathering clues. With a low grunt that sounded more like annoyance than concern, Marcus pushed himself away from the wall. He walked directly towards the girl, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the throng of students. The girl, seeing his intimidating figure approach, visibly flinched, her eyes widening in terror. She braced herself, expecting the worst. One afternoon, Ilara saw Marcus in the school library, a place he rarely frequented. He was hunched over a table in a secluded corner, not looking at textbooks, but at a worn, dog-eared children's book. His back was to the door, but Ilara caught a glimpse of the cover, a brightly colored illustration of a fairy tale. It was so out of character for the marauder that Ilara almost dismissed it as a trick of the light. But then she saw his hand, reaching out, almost tenderly, to trace a picture on the page. Before he could notice her, she quietly slipped away, a new piece added to her mental puzzle. Marcus knelt down. His movements were stiff, awkward, as if he wasn't used to bending down for anyone. He didn't look at the girl. His eyes were fixed on the scattered items on the wet pavement. He quickly, efficiently, began to gather her books, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he picked up the damp drawing, careful not to smudge it. He then picked up her backpack, shaking out the water, and began to carefully place the items back inside. Later that week, during a fire drill, Ilara observed Marcus in the chaos of the evacuation. While most students were pushing and jostling, eager to get outside, Marcus stood near the back of his class line, his eyes scanning the crowd. Ilara noticed his gaze linger for a moment on a smaller, visibly anxious freshman who looked lost. Marcus, with a subtle shift of his body, seemed to subtly guide the freshman away from the crush of students, creating a small pocket of space for him. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible gesture, but Ilara caught it. It was an act of protection, disguised by his usual gruff demeanor. It was like watching a shark subtly nudge a smaller fish away from danger, completely against its usual predatory nature. The girl stared at him, utterly bewildered. She had expected a kick, a shove, a cruel word. Instead, the marauder was helping her. A common historical fact, often explored in psychological studies, is that bullying behavior can frequently be a coping mechanism for individuals experiencing their own forms of distress, trauma, or lack of control in their personal lives. The aggression is externalized, a way to exert power in one area when they feel powerless in another. Ilara, with her quiet intuition, seemed to be sensing this underlying vulnerability in Marcus, seeing beyond the superficial acts of cruelty. Marcus finished, zipping up the backpack. He stood up, his gaze still avoiding hers, and thrust the backpack towards her. "Here," he muttered, his voice gruff, almost embarrassed. "Don't just leave your stuff lying around." Ilara also noticed Marcus's attendance patterns. He was rarely absent, always on time, and despite his disruptive behavior, he never seemed to miss a class. He also seemed to avoid certain areas of the school at specific times, almost as if he was evading something, or someone. She saw him flinch once when a teacher raised his voice unexpectedly, a reaction far too sharp for someone who projected such an image of fearlessness. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor. But Illyra's observant eyes didn't miss it. He didn't wait for a thank you. He simply turned and strode back to his spot under the overhang, his scowl firmly back in place, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. The girl, still clutching her backpack, stared after him, a bewildered expression on her face. One afternoon, as Illyra was leaving school, she saw Marcus walking alone, several blocks away from the usual student routes. He wasn't swaggering, or surrounded by his usual hangers-on. He was walking with his shoulders hunched, his head down, looking almost small. He turned down a street lined with older, more run-down houses, a stark contrast to the manicured lawns of Northwood's affluent students. Illyra, driven by a quiet curiosity she couldn't explain, subtly changed her own route, following him from a discreet distance. Illyra, from her vantage point, had watched the entire exchange. It wasn't a command. She hadn't said a word. This was Marcus's own action, a spontaneous, uncoerced act of kindness. It was brief, gruff, and delivered with all the grace of a grumpy bear. But it was undeniably kind, a genuine glimmer of humanity. It was like watching a tiny, fragile flower push its way through a crack in a concrete wall. She watched as he approached a dilapidated house, its paint peeling, its windows dark. He didn't go in immediately. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob, his shoulders slumping. He took a deep, shaky breath, as if bracing himself for something unpleasant, before finally pushing the door open and disappearing inside. The scene was brief, but it painted a picture of a life far removed from the image of the invincible marauder. It was like watching a tough, predatory animal suddenly transform into a timid, vulnerable creature when it returned to its lair. A common historical fact, often explored in moral development, is that truly altruistic behavior, even if initially reluctant, can begin to reshape an individual's sense of self and their place in a community. While Marcus's act was perhaps born of a nascent empathy he didn't yet understand, it was a crucial step away from purely self-serving aggression. It's like a medieval knight, after years of pillaging, suddenly deciding to help a peasant simply because it felt right, not because he was ordered to. A lesser-known detail about the psychology of bullies, particularly those from difficult home environments, is that they often develop a heightened sense of vigilance and an almost hyper-awareness of their surroundings. This constant state of alert, born from a need for self-preservation, can manifest as aggression or a need to control others, as a way to preemptively protect themselves from perceived threats. Illyra's observations of Marcus's subtle flinches and his scanning eyes hinted at this underlying anxiety. Later that week, Illyra saw another subtle shift. During a particularly challenging group project in history class, one of Marcus's usual hangers-on, a boy named Kyle, was struggling with a complex research task. He was clearly frustrated, on the verge of giving up. Marcus, who was supposed to be working on his own part of the project, glanced over. Illyra didn't pry or confront him about what she saw. She simply filed the information away, adding it to the growing collection of inconsistencies. She began to see the cracks in his armor, the small glimpses of a different Marcus beneath the hardened exterior. The bully wasn't just a force of nature, he was a person. And like all people, he had his own unseen vulnerabilities, his own hidden pains. He didn't offer help directly. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, seemingly disinterested, and muttered, just loud enough for Kyle to hear. "You're looking at the wrong source, idiot. Check the primary documents section under Treaties of Westphalia, and stop mumbling, no one can hear you." She started to notice that Marcus rarely ate a full lunch. He'd pick at his food, sometimes pushing it around his tray, or even leaving half of it untouched. This was unusual for a teenage boy, especially one who exerted so much physical energy. It hinted at a deeper issue, perhaps a lack of food at home, or an underlying stress that affected his appetite. The contrast between his intimidating presence and this subtle sign of neglect was stark. Kyle, startled, looked at Marcus, then at the history book. He grumbled but followed the advice. A few minutes later, a flicker of understanding crossed his face. He had found the information. He looked back at Marcus, a hesitant, almost grateful look in his eyes. Marcus, meanwhile, was pretending to be deeply engrossed in his own work. But Illyra caught the subtle shift in his posture, a slight relaxation of his shoulders. It was a moment of unacknowledged assistance, a hidden act of mentorship. It was like a grumpy wizard secretly helping a struggling apprentice, pretending he's just annoyed by their incompetence. Historians still debate the precise socio-economic factors that contribute to bullying behaviors in different eras and cultures. While modern research points to a complex interplay of individual psychology, family dynamics, and social environments, the historical record often lacks the granular detail to fully understand the motivations of individual bullies in past societies. This remains an open academic question: how much of Marcus's behavior was a product of his individual circumstances, and how much was a reflection of broader societal pressures or norms. A lesser-known detail about the psychology of bullies who are beginning to change is that they often perform these initial acts of kindness in a gruff, almost dismissive manner to protect their image and avoid appearing soft. They are testing the waters, exploring a new way of interacting without fully committing to it. Ilara understood this, recognizing the genuine intent beneath the rough exterior. Ilara's observations weren't driven by malice or a desire to expose him. They were driven by a quiet, almost scientific curiosity. She saw a puzzle, a complex human being whose outward behavior seemed to contradict the subtle cues she was picking up. She was beginning to understand that Marcus's aggression wasn't random. It was a symptom, a defense mechanism, a roar born from a deeper, unseen wound. These small, uncoerced acts, though rare, began to accumulate. Marcus still had his temper, still had his scowl, but the pure, unadulterated malice that once defined him seemed to be slowly, almost imperceptibly, fading. He was still a difficult person, but he was no longer just the marauder. He was Marcus, a complex individual grappling with his past, his present, and a future he hadn't yet dared to imagine. One afternoon, she saw Marcus in the schoolyard, alone, kicking a worn soccer ball against a wall. He moved with a surprising agility, his powerful kicks precise and controlled. He wasn't playing with anyone, he was practicing, relentlessly, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was a glimpse of discipline, of focus, of a hidden talent that he never displayed in public. It was another piece of the puzzle, hinting at a life beyond the school hallways. His resentment towards Ilara was still present, a constant undercurrent, but it was now mixed with a strange, grudging respect, and perhaps a nascent sense of dependence. She was the only one who truly saw him, who understood his burden, and who held the key to his secret. She was also the only one who dared to push him, to challenge him, to make him confront the better parts of himself. He hated it, but he also, deep down, knew he needed it. As the days turned into weeks, Ilara's mental file on Marcus Thorne grew. She noticed the way he sometimes rubbed his temple, as if nursing a headache, the way he avoided eye contact with certain older students, a flicker of something akin to fear in his eyes, the way he always seemed to be alone outside of his crew, a profound loneliness that his bravado couldn't quite mask. She was seeing the marauder not as a monster, but as a boy, albeit a deeply troubled one, hiding behind a terrifying facade. Historians still debate the precise mechanisms of individual moral transformation in oppressive or challenging social environments. While external pressure can force behavioral changes, the internal shift towards genuine empathy and altruism is often a more complex and prolonged process. Marcus's journey, forced by Ilara's leverage, raises the academic question: at what point does coerced compliance transition into genuine, self-motivated change? And what factors truly drive that internal shift? The stage was now set. Ilara had gathered enough fragments, enough subtle hints, to begin to piece together the deeper reason for Marcus Thorne's aggression. She had seen the unseen vulnerabilities, the cracks in his armor, and soon, this quiet, observant transfer student would hold a secret that would not only explain the marauder's rage, but would give her an unexpected, terrifying power over him. The unraveling of Northwood High's unspoken hierarchy was about to begin. Ilara, for her part, continued her quiet observation. She didn't praise Marcus for his small acts of kindness, knowing it would likely make him retreat further into his shell. She simply acknowledged them with a subtle nod, a quiet glance, a silent understanding that conveyed, "I see you. I see what you're doing, and it matters." Her unwavering belief in his potential, even when he didn't believe in it himself, was a powerful, silent force. You've seen Ilara's quiet observations, the subtle cracks she's noticed in Marcus Thorne's formidable armor, She's pieced together enough fragments to suspect that the marauder's aggression isn't just random cruelty, but a shield. A performance? Now, you are about to witness the moment she uncovers the crucial, deeply personal secret that explains his bullying behavior and gives her an unexpected, terrifying leverage over him. You find yourself following Alara, her quiet determination a palpable force, as she ventures further into the hidden corners of Northwood High and beyond. As the days continued, the atmosphere around Marcus Thorne at Northwood High continued to subtly transform. The fear was slowly being replaced by a cautious curiosity, a sense that the marauder was changing, becoming something new, something less terrifying. He was still isolated, but the loneliness he carried seemed less profound. Perhaps because he was no longer entirely alone in his secret, the stage was now set for a new shadow to fall over Northwood High, a threat that would force Marcus and Alara into an uneasy, unspoken alliance, pushing their strange relationship to its ultimate test, and truly beginning his path to redemption. The dilapidated house Marcus entered, several blocks from the typical student routes, had lingered in Alara's mind. It didn't fit the image of the feared marauder, who seemed to exist purely within the confines of the school and its immediate, more affluent surroundings. The way he had hesitated at the door, the slump of his shoulders, it spoke of burden, not power. Alara, driven by an instinct she couldn't quite articulate, felt compelled to understand. Her curiosity wasn't malicious, it was a quiet, almost academic pursuit of truth, a desire to solve the puzzle that was Marcus Thorne. You've witnessed the subtle, grudging transformation of Marcus Thorne, the marauder, his humanity beginning to glimmer through the cracks in his hardened exterior. Alara Vance's quiet influence had steered him away from overt bullying, creating a cautious sense of hope at Northwood High. But the peace was fragile, and the school's ecosystem, subtly altered by Alara's presence, was about to face a new, more sinister threat. This wasn't a familiar, predictable bully. This was a shadow, colder and more calculating, that would force Marcus and Alara into an uneasy, unspoken alliance. You find yourself in a new kind of tension at Northwood, a quiet unease that feels far more dangerous than Marcus's loudest roars. One rainy afternoon, a few days after seeing Marcus enter the house, Alara found herself walking home the same route. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the unpaved sections of the sidewalk into muddy rivulets. As she approached the dilapidated house, she noticed the front door was slightly ajar, rattling faintly in the wind. A flicker of movement caught her eye inside. Hesitantly, she paused, her hand gripping the handlebars of her bicycle. She knew she shouldn't intrude, but something compelled her. A faint, distressed sound, like a whimper, reached her ears. The new student arrived without fanfare. His name was Julian Hayes. He was impeccably dressed, always with a faint, knowing smirk on his lips that never quite reached his eyes. Unlike Marcus, Julian didn't rely on physical intimidation or loud displays of power. His weapon was manipulation, his currency, information. He moved through the school like a ghost, seemingly everywhere and nowhere, always observing, always listening. You could almost feel the chill when he passed by, a subtle shift in the air, as if a predator had just entered the room. Pushing the door open just a crack, Alara peered inside. The interior was dark, cluttered, and smelled faintly of damp wood and something else. Something sickly sweet, like stale medicine. The whimper came again, louder this time. Her eyes adjusted to the gloom, and she saw him. Marcus. He was hunched over a worn armchair in the living room, his back to her, his broad shoulders shaking. And in his lap, nestled under a threadbare blanket, was a small, frail figure. Julian quickly established his own form of dominance, not through fear of violence, but through fear of exposure. He had an uncanny ability to discover secrets, embarrassing moments, or minor transgressions, and then use them to subtly control others. A whispered word in the hallway, a knowing glance, a casual comment about someone's private life. These were his tools. Students found themselves doing his bidding, not out of terror of a punch, but out of dread that their own hidden shame would be brought to light. It was a far more insidious form of bullying, a slow, psychological strangulation. It was an elderly woman, incredibly thin, her skin papery and pale. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and ragged. Marcus was gently dabbing her forehead with a damp cloth, his movements surprisingly tender, utterly devoid of his usual roughness. The whimper had come from her, a soft moan of discomfort. Alara watched, frozen, as Marcus murmured soothing words, his voice low and gentle, a tone she had never heard him use. He was stroking the woman's wispy white hair, his large hand moving with a delicacy that was shocking to witness. Marcus, despite his own past, seemed to instinctively dislike Julian. He saw the cold calculation in Julian's eyes, the way he toyed with people, and it rubbed him the wrong way. The marauder, for all his flaws, had a certain brutal honesty. Julian was a snake, slithering in the shadows. Alara, too, sensed the new threat immediately. Julian's methods were subtle, but his intent was clear: to control, to dominate, and to exploit. He was everything Marcus had been, but without the underlying pain, without the glimmer of humanity. He was pure, unadulterated malice. Then, the woman coughed, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to tear through her fragile frame. Marcus flinched, his face contorting in a grimace of pain and helplessness. He looked utterly devastated, his usual mask of indifference completely gone. In that moment, Alara saw him not as the marauder, but as a terrified, vulnerable boy, burdened by a responsibility far too heavy for his young shoulders. This was his secret. This was the source of his unseen vulnerabilities. A common historical fact, often explored in studies of social dynamics, is that power vacuums or shifts in established hierarchies can often lead to the emergence of new, sometimes more dangerous, forms of control. As Marcus's reign as the marauder softened, a space opened for a new kind of predator, one who operated with cunning rather than brute force. It's like a medieval kingdom where the old, loud warlord is replaced by a quiet, conniving spy master. The woman was clearly very ill, perhaps terminally so. And Marcus, the feared bully of Northwood High, was her sole caregiver. The dilapidated house, the worn clothes, the skipped lunches, it all clicked into place. He wasn't snatching lunch money to flaunt it. He was likely using it for medicine, for food, for the myriad expenses that come with caring for a severely ill person in poverty. His aggression at school wasn't about pure malice. It was a desperate, misguided attempt to maintain control in a life where he had none, to project strength when he felt utterly powerless and alone. Julian's gaze, unnervingly often, seemed to land on Alara. He watched her with a peculiar intensity, as if trying to unravel her quiet composure. He sensed her influence over Marcus, a power he couldn't quite grasp, and it intrigued him. He saw her as a challenge, a puzzle to solve, and perhaps a new target. You could feel the subtle shift in his focus, the way his eyes lingered on her, a predatory glint in their depths. Alara felt a pang of something akin to sympathy, mixed with a profound understanding. This was the deep, unseen wound she had sensed. This was the roar born from a place of fear and desperation. She knew, instinctively, that this was a secret Marcus would protect with every fiber of his being. The shame, the vulnerability, the fear of judgment, it would be unbearable for someone who had built such a formidable wall around himself. One afternoon, a student named Chloe, known for her vibrant, often outrageous fashion choices, came to school looking utterly distraught. Her usual bright clothes were replaced by drab, oversized garments, and her eyes were red-rimmed. Whispers spread quickly Julian had somehow gotten hold of embarrassing photos of her from a private social media account, and had subtly threatened to leak them if she didn't comply with his demands. Chloe, terrified, had succumbed. It was a chilling demonstration of Julian's power. A stark contrast to Marcus's more direct methods. She quietly backed away, her footsteps barely audible on the worn wooden floorboards. She didn't want to be seen, didn't want to intrude on this intensely private, painful moment. As she slipped back out into the rain, the whimper of the old woman still echoing in her ears, she felt the weight of the knowledge she now possessed. It wasn't just a secret, it was a profound truth about Marcus Thorne, a truth that gave her an unexpected, terrifying power over him. Marcus, seeing Chloe's distress, felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected: anger on someone else's behalf. He remembered the shame of his own hidden life, the fear of exposure. He looked at Alara, who was watching Julian with a quiet, intense gaze. Their eyes met, a silent acknowledgement of the new, shared threat. The marauder, who had once been the source of such fear, now found himself in a strange, unspoken alliance with the girl who controlled him. A common historical fact, often overlooked in the context of medieval or pre-modern societies, is the immense burden placed on individuals, especially children, when caring for the chronically or terminally ill in the absence of organized healthcare or social safety nets. The sheer physical and emotional toll, coupled with financial strain, could be overwhelming. Marcus, in his own way, was living a version of this ancient struggle, isolated and unsupported. It's like being a medieval peasant suddenly tasked with running a hospital, but you're also still expected to go to school and be a terrifying bully. A lesser-known detail about the psychology of manipulative bullies like Julian is their reliance on cultivating a network of informants and leveraging social anxieties. They don't need physical strength when they have access to everyone's secrets and the ability to turn peers against each other through rumor and innuendo. Ilara, with her quiet observation, was beginning to see the intricate web Julian was weaving, a far more dangerous trap than Marcus had ever set. Ilara spent the rest of the evening processing what she had seen. The marauder, the untouchable, the terrifying force of Northwood High, was a caregiver, a boy struggling under the weight of poverty and illness. This wasn't just a weakness she could exploit, it was a vulnerability that demanded a different kind of response. Her initial curiosity had given way to a complex mix of emotions. Julian's tactics escalated. He started targeting students who were friends with Marcus or who had shown any signs of benefiting from Ilara's subtle influence. He would spread rumors, create misunderstandings, or subtly undermine their social standing. He was trying to isolate Ilara, to break her spirit, and to reestablish a clear, unchallenged hierarchy where he sat at the top. He even began to subtly undermine Marcus, planting seeds of doubt about his softening behavior, trying to provoke him back into his old ways. The next day at school, Ilara observed Marcus with new eyes. His usual scowl seemed heavier, his movements more tired. She noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the way he sometimes stifled a yawn. He was probably up all night, caring for the old woman. His bullying, though still present, seemed to lack its usual venom, almost perfunctory, as if he was just going through the motions. One day, a particularly vicious rumor started circulating about Ilara, something about her family, about her poverty, twisted and exaggerated to make her sound pathetic and weak. It was clearly Julian's work, designed to expose her vulnerabilities and diminish her quiet power. The whispers followed Ilara in the hallways, students glancing at her with pity or disdain. A lesser-known detail about the psychology of bullies, particularly those in Marcus's situation, is that their aggression can sometimes be a desperate cry for help, a way to draw attention to their own suffering without explicitly asking for it. They create chaos around them because their internal world is already chaotic. Ilara, by seeing past the aggression to the underlying pain, was unknowingly stepping into a role no one else had dared to fill. Ilara felt the sting of it, but she maintained her composure. She knew this was Julian's attempt to get a reaction, to break her. But Marcus, hearing the whispers, felt a surge of unexpected fury. This was his secret, his vulnerability, and Julian was using it to hurt Ilara. It was a violation, a betrayal of the unspoken bond that had formed between them. The marauder, who had once guarded his own shame so fiercely, now felt a fierce protectiveness over Ilara's. Ilara knew she couldn't just ignore what she had seen. She also knew she couldn't expose Marcus. The shame would destroy him, and likely make his situation even worse. But she couldn't let him continue to terrorize the school either. She had to use this knowledge, this unexpected leverage, but not in a way that would harm him further. She had to make him obey her, not through fear, but through a quiet, undeniable understanding of his secret. He confronted Julian in the hallway, his usual scowl replaced by a cold, dangerous fury that was far more terrifying than his usual bluster. "What are you doing, Hayes?" Marcus snarled, his voice low and menacing. "Spreading lies about people." She began to formulate a plan. It wasn't about revenge, or even about teaching him a lesson in the traditional sense. It was about redirecting his energy, about making him use his formidable presence for something other than cruelty. She had seen glimpses of a different Marcus, the one who gently guided the lost freshman, the one who practiced soccer with discipline, the one who tenderly cared for an old woman. That Marcus was still there, buried deep beneath layers of anger and fear. Julian merely smirked, unperturbed. "Just stating facts, Thorn." She's a poor transfer. Nothing wrong with that. Is there? Unless you have something to hide. 2. His eyes flickered to Marcus, a knowing, challenging glint in their depths. He was trying to provoke Marcus into a fight, to expose his anger, to make him revert to his old, predictable ways. The opportunity presented itself during lunch the following day. Marcus was back at his corner table, alone as usual, glowering at anyone who dared to glance his way. Alara, with her tray, walked directly towards him. The cafeteria fell silent, a collective intake of breath. This was it. Round 2. Marcus's fists clenched. He wanted to smash Julian's smug face, but then he remembered Ilara's quiet words, her steady gaze, her subtle commands to use his strength for good. He saw the trap Julian was laying. He took a deep, shaky breath, forcing himself to control his rage. She sat down opposite him, just as she had on her first day. Marcus's head snapped up, his eyes blazing. "You again," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "I thought I made myself clear." "Leave her alone, Hayes," Marcus growled, his voice strained with effort. "Or you'll regret it." It wasn't a threat of physical violence, not exactly, but a promise of consequences, delivered with a chilling conviction that surprised even Julian. Ilara calmly placed her tray down. She looked at him, her gaze steady, unwavering. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough for him to hear. "How is your grandmother doing?" Julian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He hadn't expected Marcus to hold back, to control his temper. He had expected a predictable explosion, something he could exploit. This new, controlled Marcus was an unknown variable, and it unnerved him. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Marcus froze. His face, which had been contorted in a mask of anger, went utterly blank. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him ashen. His eyes, usually so fierce, widened with a raw, naked fear that Ilara had never seen before. He looked like a cornered animal, exposed and vulnerable. The marauder was gone, replaced by a terrified boy. Historians still debate the effectiveness of different forms of social resistance against bullying and manipulation. While direct confrontation can sometimes escalate conflict, a unified front or unexpected defiance from a former antagonist can disrupt a bully's power base. Marcus's controlled anger, a departure from his usual behavior, served as a powerful, albeit subtle, form of resistance against Julian's tactics. This remains an open academic question. How much can a change in one individual's behavior truly impact the dynamics of an entire social system? He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His hands clenched, then unclenched, trembling slightly. The cafeteria, still silent, seemed to hold its breath. No one else had heard Ilara's quiet question, but they saw Marcus's reaction, and it was profound. Ilara, watching from a distance, felt a flicker of something akin to pride. Marcus had resisted the urge to lash out. He had used his presence, his formidable aura, not for aggression, but for protection. The marauder was changing, truly changing, not just because he was forced, but because a new, deeper sense of justice was beginning to stir within him. Ilara leaned forward slightly, her voice still a whisper, for his ears only. "I saw her yesterday," she continued, her voice gentle, devoid of judgment. "She looks very weak. Does she have enough medicine?" The new shadow of Julian Hayes had indeed fallen over Northwood High, a more insidious and dangerous threat than anything Marcus had ever been. But in doing so, Julian had inadvertently forged an uneasy, unspoken alliance between the former bully and the quiet transfer student. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would test their fragile bond, push Marcus to his limits, and ultimately determine the true fate of Northwood High. The journey towards redemption, for Marcus, was about to become a desperate fight for survival, for himself, and for Ilara. Marcus stared at her, his eyes wide with shock and a dawning horror. He knew, she knew, his deepest, most carefully guarded secret, the source of his shame and his pain, was now known to the new girl, the girl he had tried so hard to intimidate, to scare away. The girl who now held his most vulnerable truth in her quiet hands. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The marauder was no longer in control. He was utterly, terrifyingly, at her mercy. You've witnessed Marcus Thorne's surprising, controlled defiance against Julian Hayes, a clear sign that the Marauder was truly changing, not just under Alara's quiet command, but from a burgeoning sense of justice within him. Julian, however, was not one to be deterred. His smirk had faltered for a moment, but his resolve to dominate Northwood High, and particularly to break Alara's quiet influence, only hardened. You now find yourself in the crucible of a new conflict, where the insidious tactics of Julian Hayes force Marcus and Alara into an uneasy, unspoken alliance, testing their fragile bond and forging a trust neither of them ever expected. The air at Northwood crackles with a silent war, fought with whispers, secrets, and the looming threat of exposure. The cafeteria remained in an unnatural, suspended silence. Marcus Thorne, the Marauder, stood utterly paralyzed, his face a mask of shock and raw vulnerability. Alara Vance's quiet words, "How is your grandmother doing, and does she have enough medicine?" had struck him with the force of a physical blow, bypassing all his defenses. His secret, his deepest shame, the very source of his pain and his carefully constructed persona, was now exposed. He stared at Alara, his eyes wide, a dawning horror in their depths. He knew, with chilling certainty, that his reign of terror, built on fear and intimidation, had just come crashing down. Julian's response to Marcus's warning was swift and calculated. He understood that direct confrontation with the new, controlled Marcus was unproductive. Instead, he escalated his psychological warfare, aiming to isolate Alara and Marcus from any potential allies and to undermine their newfound, unspoken bond. He began to subtly spread rumors that Alara was manipulating Marcus, using his secret for her own gain, turning the cautious optimism of the student body into suspicion. He also intensified his attacks on students who had shown any sign of being helped by Marcus, making it clear that associating with the former Marauder, or the new transfer girl, came with a heavy price. Alara, meanwhile, maintained her calm, unwavering gaze. She wasn't gloating, not even triumphant. Her expression was one of quiet understanding, almost empathy. She had seen his raw fear, the naked vulnerability in his eyes, and it confirmed everything she had suspected. This wasn't a monster. This was a boy drowning under an unbearable burden. She had found the true key to Marcus Thorne, and it wasn't fear, but compassion, or at least, the knowledge of his profound weakness. One afternoon, a small group of students who had recently benefited from Marcus's grudging assistance, a freshman he'd helped with a jammed locker, a sophomore he'd quietly pointed towards the right bus, found themselves targeted. Their lockers were vandalized, their homework mysteriously lost, and embarrassing rumors about them suddenly circulated. The message was clear: Julian was watching, and he would punish anyone who deviated from his new order. The fear that had begun to dissipate around Marcus now resurfaced, redirected towards Julian, a colder, more insidious dread. How do you know?" Marcus finally managed to croak, his voice a strained whisper, utterly devoid of its usual menace. He looked around the cafeteria, at the hundreds of eyes fixed on him, but no one had heard Alara's soft words. Their attention was on his reaction, on the unprecedented sight of the Marauder utterly undone. Alara and Marcus found themselves increasingly isolated, a strange island in the turbulent waters of Northwood High. Students, once curious, now avoided them, fearing Julian's retaliation. This forced isolation, however, inadvertently pushed Alara and Marcus closer. They were the only ones who truly understood the nature of Julian's threat, and the only ones who had dared to stand against him. Their silent agreement to combat Julian became a necessity, a shared burden that began to chip away at Marcus's lingering resentment. Alara leaned back slightly, a subtle shift that somehow made her seem even more in control. "It doesn't matter how I know, Marcus," she replied, her voice still a whisper, for his ears only. "What matters is that I know. And now, you know, I know." She let that sink in, the simple truth of it hanging between them. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had inverted completely. He, the predator, was now the prey, held captive by a truth he couldn't afford to have exposed. "He's trying to get to you." Marcus grumbled one lunch, pushing his food around his tray. He didn't look at Alara, but his voice was laced with a rare, almost protective concern. "All those rumors about your family, it's his doing." Marcus's jaw worked, his eyes darting wildly. He was trapped. He could lash out, of course. But what then? Violence against her would only draw more attention, more questions. And if his secret came out, if anyone at Northwood High knew about his grandmother, about the dilapidated house, about his poverty, the shame would be unbearable. His entire carefully built facade would crumble. He had spent years cultivating an image of unshakable strength, of being untouchable. This new girl, with a few quiet words, had utterly demolished it. Alara nodded, her gaze fixed on the crowded cafeteria, observing Julian's subtle movements. "I know," she replied, her voice calm. "He wants a reaction. He wants to see me break." "What do you want?" he hissed, the anger returning, but now laced with a desperate, trapped edge. "Money to tell everyone." "You won't, though, will you?" Marcus asked, a hint of something akin to admiration in his voice. He still hated being controlled, but he couldn't deny her resilience. It was a quality he secretly admired, perhaps even envied. Alara shook her head slowly. "I don't want to tell anyone. Marcus," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "and I don't want your money. I want you to stop." "No," Alara said, meeting his gaze. "But he's getting bolder, and he's hurting other people to get to us." Marcus blinked, confused. "Stop what?" This resonated with Marcus. He might have been a bully, but Julian's method of indirect psychological torment, of using people's weaknesses against them, felt fundamentally wrong to him. It lacked the perverse honesty of his own past aggression. It was like a medieval knight who, despite his own brutal ways, finds himself disgusted by a sneaky assassin who poisons wells. "Stop being the marauder," Alara clarified, her gaze steady. "Stop scaring people. Stop making their lives miserable. Stop being a bully." A common historical fact, often observed in group dynamics, is that a shared external threat can often forge unlikely alliances, even between individuals who were previously antagonists. The common enemy, in this case, Julian, forces individuals to set aside their internal conflicts and work together for mutual survival. Alara and Marcus, despite their complicated history, were now bound by this primal need for self-preservation and a shared sense of justice. He scoffed, a hollow, humorless sound. "And why would I do that?" he challenged, trying to regain some semblance of control. Though his voice still trembled faintly, the incidents escalated. Julian began tampering with Marcus's schoolwork, subtly altering files on shared drives or deleting assignments, making it appear as though Marcus was slacking off or incompetent. This was a direct attack on Marcus's academic standing, which, despite his tough exterior, he secretly valued as a pathway out of his difficult circumstances. He needed good grades to secure a scholarship, to escape the poverty that plagued his home life. Alara leaned forward again, her voice dropping even lower, compelling him to listen. "Because if you don't," she said, her eyes holding his, "then maybe someone else will find out about your grandmother. Someone less understanding than me." The unspoken threat hung in the air, chilling and precise. It wasn't a promise of malice, but a stark statement of consequence. She wasn't threatening to expose him herself, but rather to let the natural course of events, the curious whispers of a high school, do the work for her if he didn't comply. It was a terrifyingly clever form of blackmail, delivered with the quiet grace of a librarian. One afternoon, Marcus found a crucial history essay, due the next day, completely deleted from his school account. He stared at the blank screen, his face paling, a cold dread seizing him. He knew it was Julian. His fists clenched, his anger a boiling inferno. He wanted to find Julian and unleash every ounce of his pent-up rage. Marcus recoiled, as if struck. The implication was clear. She wouldn't have to do anything. His secret was fragile, and if he continued his destructive path, it would inevitably be discovered by someone less empathetic. He imagined the whispers, the mockery, the pity. The thought was unbearable. His carefully constructed world, built on intimidation, would collapse into a heap of shame and ridicule. Alara, who had been working quietly nearby, saw his distress. She walked over, her expression concerned. "What's wrong?" He stood there, towering over her, yet feeling utterly diminished. His fists clenched and unclenched. The rage was still there, a churning storm inside him, but it was now mixed with fear. helplessness, and a dawning, terrifying realization he was no longer in control. This quiet, poor transfer student, whom no one had dared sit near, now held his entire life in her delicate hands. Marcus slammed his hand on the desk, making the computer jump. "My essay! It's gone! He deleted it! That snake! Hayes!" His voice was a low snarl filled with raw fury. A common historical fact, often observed in power dynamics, is that true control is rarely about brute force alone. It's about leverage, about understanding vulnerabilities, and about the ability to manipulate consequences. Ilara, despite her physical disadvantage, had mastered this art, turning Marcus's greatest weakness into her greatest strength. It's like a chess match where one player suddenly realizes their king is exposed and the other player has a secret queen. Ilara calmly looked at the screen. "Did you save it anywhere else? A flash drive, a cloud backup?" Marcus finally took a shaky breath. He looked at Ilara, then around the cafeteria, then back at Ilara. His eyes were desperate, searching for an escape, a loophole. There was none. He was trapped. Marcus shook his head, desperation in his eyes. "No, I was going to, but I got distracted. It's gone. I'm going to fail. My scholarship." His voice trailed off, the vulnerability in his tone stark. "What? What do you want me to do?" he finally whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The marauder had spoken, but it was the voice of a defeated boy. Ilara didn't hesitate. "Okay, deep breaths. We don't have time to panic. When did you last work on it?" Ilara offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. "We'll start small," she said, her voice still soft, but now with a hint of quiet authority. "Tomorrow, during lunch, you're going to give back Kevin Miller's lunch money, all of it. And you're going to apologize," Marcus stammered, trying to recall. "This morning, I finished the last paragraph." Marcus's eyes widened. Kevin Miller was a scrawny, terrified freshman he had been tormenting for weeks. Giving back his money and apologizing. It was unthinkable. It was a public humiliation, a direct contradiction of everything the marauder stood for. "No," he growled, a flicker of his old defiance returning. "I'm not doing that." "All right," Ilara said, her mind already racing. "It might still be in the temporary files or a hidden recovery folder. It'll be tricky, but we might be able to find it." She pulled up a chair beside him, her fingers already flying across the keyboard, accessing hidden directories and running complex searches. Marcus watched her, bewildered, his anger slowly giving way to a grudging admiration for her technical prowess. It was like watching a wizard cast a spell on a medieval scroll, but the spell was code and the scroll was a computer screen. Ilara simply raised an eyebrow, a silent, knowing look that spoke volumes. She didn't need to repeat her threat. He understood. A lesser-known detail about the psychology of trust is that it often forms not through grand gestures, but through shared vulnerability and mutual problem-solving. In this moment, Marcus was forced to be vulnerable, to admit his helplessness. And Ilara was there, not to judge, but to help. This shared struggle, this reliance on each other's unique strengths, began to lay the groundwork for genuine trust. However fragile, he stared at her, his face a contorted mess of anger, shame, and reluctant submission. He wanted to refuse, to fight, to run, but the image of his frail grandmother, the dilapidated house, the crushing weight of his secret, it held him captive. He was caught in a cage of his own making, and Ilara held the key. They worked together for hours, Ilara meticulously navigating the computer's hidden pathways, Marcus providing details about the essay's content, his anger slowly morphing into intense focus. He found himself answering her questions, offering suggestions, a strange sense of collaboration blossoming between them. He even managed a small, almost imperceptible thank you when Ilara finally, miraculously, recovered a nearly complete draft of his essay from a temporary file. The relief that washed over him was immense, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of genuine gratitude towards Ilara. A lesser-known detail about the nature of coercive control is that the first act of submission, even a small one, can be the most difficult. But it also establishes the new power dynamic. Once Marcus obeyed this initial command, the path for further obedience would become easier, his resistance slowly eroding. Ilara wasn't just asking him to do something. She was subtly reshaping his identity, forcing him to act against his established persona. Julian, meanwhile, continued his campaign, growing bolder. He started leaving anonymous, threatening notes in Alara's locker, filled with veiled references to her family's poverty and her grandmother's illness. He wanted to break her calm, to make her lash out, to expose her own vulnerabilities. He even tried to subtly turn some of Marcus's former hangers-on against him, planting seeds of doubt about Marcus's softness and Alara's control. Marcus slowly, reluctantly, nodded. It was a barely perceptible movement, a concession wrung from the depths of his humiliation. "Fine," he muttered, his voice thick with resentment. "But if anyone finds out—" One afternoon, Alara found a particularly nasty note tucked into her locker, detailing intimate, humiliating details about her family's financial struggles. Her hands trembled slightly as she read it, a rare flicker of pain in her usually composed eyes. "No one will," Alara promised, her voice calm and steady. "Unless you give them a reason to." She picked up her tray, her lunch half-eaten. "See you tomorrow, Marcus." Marcus, who happened to be walking by, saw her face. His own features darkened. He knew Julian's handwriting. He knew the kind of information Julian dealt in. He remembered the shame of his own secret, the fear of exposure. He felt a surge of protective fury that was no longer coerced, but genuine. This was his secret, his pain, and Julian was using it to hurt Alara. It was a violation. She stood up, leaving him sitting there, utterly defeated, in the middle of the buzzing cafeteria. The students, who had been covertly watching the entire exchange, saw Marcus's slumped shoulders, his downcast gaze, and Alara's quiet, confident departure. They didn't know what had been said, but they knew, instinctively, that something monumental had just occurred. The marauder had been brought to heel, not by force, but by a quiet, unassuming girl who had dared to sit at his table and then, somehow, made him obey her every word. The first command had been issued, and the terrifying, unexpected journey of Marcus Thorne's transformation had truly begun. He snatched the note from her hand, his eyes blazing. "What is this?" he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. The cafeteria, still humming with the aftershocks of the confrontation, slowly emptied. Marcus Thorne remained, slumped on the bench, the weight of Alara Vance's words pressing down on him. His mind reeled. His secret, the carefully guarded shame of his grandmother's illness and his family's poverty, was out, and the new girl, the quiet, unassuming Alara, held it. He was no longer the marauder, the untouchable king of Northwood High. He was a boy, exposed and vulnerable, cornered by a truth he couldn't deny. He felt a chilling sense of powerlessness, a feeling he usually inflicted on others, now turned inward. Alara looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise at his sudden, unprompted anger. "It's nothing," she said, trying to take it back. "Just Julian being Julian." The next morning, the air in Northwood High was thick with unspoken anticipation. Everyone knew something had happened in the cafeteria, even if they didn't know the specifics. Marcus was quieter than usual, his scowl deeper, his eyes darting nervously. He avoided Alara, a subtle shift in his usual aggressive pursuit. Students watched, fascinated, as the dynamic between the bully and the new girl continued to defy all expectations. You could almost feel the collective holding of breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, but Marcus crumpled the note in his fist, his knuckles white. "No," he growled, his voice thick with a raw, unfamiliar emotion. "This is not nothing. He's going too far." He looked at Alara, his gaze fierce. "We're going to stop him." Lunchtime arrived, a stage for the day's drama. Kevin Miller, a scrawny freshman with perpetually wide, terrified eyes, walked into the cafeteria, clutching his lunch tray. He saw Marcus Thorne at his usual table, alone, and instinctively veered sharply to the left, trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and the marauder. Kevin had been Marcus's favorite target for weeks, his lunch money a regular tribute to the bully's reign. Alara stared at him, a profound sense of surprise washing over her. This wasn't a command. This was Marcus, acting on his own, driven by a new, unexpected sense of loyalty and justice. The transformation was happening, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. Alara Vance entered the cafeteria, her gaze calm and steady. She saw Marcus, then her eyes flickered to Kevin. She walked directly towards Marcus's table, her steps unhurried. The cafeteria, once again, fell silent. Historians still debate the precise tipping point in the transformation of individuals from antagonists to allies, particularly when the relationship is born of coercion. While shared threats can accelerate this process, genuine trust often requires a moment where one individual acts out of unprompted concern or protection for the other. Marcus's uncoerced fury at Julian's targeting of Alara marked a crucial turning point in their relationship. This remains an open academic question. What specific emotional or psychological triggers cause a coerced alliance to evolve into genuine loyalty? Marcus's head snapped up as Alara approached. His eyes, usually defiant, now held a flicker of dread. He knew what was coming. He had agreed, reluctantly. But the thought of actually doing it, of publicly humiliating himself, made his stomach churn. He wanted to lash out, to scream, to run, but he couldn't. The image of his grandmother, frail and dependent, flashed in his mind, a powerful leash that Alara held. Their alliance, once unspoken and forced, was now becoming something more. They began to strategize together, quietly, discreetly. Alara, with her keen intellect and observational skills, would analyze Julian's patterns, his network of informants, and his methods. Marcus, with his knowledge of the school's social undercurrents and his formidable presence, would provide insights into Julian's vulnerabilities and potential weaknesses. They were a strange, unlikely pair, the quiet strategist and the reformed brute, united against a common, insidious enemy. Alara sat down opposite him. She didn't say a word. She just looked at him, her eyes holding that quiet, knowing expectation. The silent pressure was immense, far more effective than any shouted command. You might hear a lighthearted joke about their dynamic. It was like a buddy cop movie, but one of them was a former villain, and the other communicated mostly through meaningful glances. They were the brains and brawn of Northwood, if the brawn was still a bit grumpy about it. Marcus swallowed hard. His gaze flickered to Kevin Miller, who was now nervously trying to find a seat as far away as possible. Marcus's face was a mask of internal conflict. His pride, his carefully constructed image, screamed in protest, but the fear of exposure, the vulnerability of his secret, was a stronger force. They learned to anticipate Julian's moves, to subtly counter his rumors, to protect his targets. Marcus would appear seemingly by chance when Julian was about to corner someone, his silent presence enough to deter the manipulator. Alara would subtly spread counter-narratives, or offer discreet support to Julian's victims, empowering them to resist. Their individual strengths, once so disparate, now complemented each other perfectly. With a visible effort, Marcus pushed himself up from the bench. His movements were stiff, reluctant. Every eye in the cafeteria was on him. He walked slowly, deliberately, towards Kevin Miller, who saw him coming and visibly flinched, almost dropping his tray. Kevin's eyes widened in terror. Expecting the usual taunts or a shove, the terrifying aspect of Julian's bullying was its psychological nature, its ability to erode trust and create widespread paranoia. But in doing so, he had inadvertently forged a bond between two unlikely allies, a bond that was growing stronger with each shared challenge. The stage was now set for the ultimate confrontation, a climax where Alara and Marcus would face Julian Hayes, and where Marcus would fully commit to using his strength for good, leading to the antagonist's downfall and his own profound public redemption. The fragile trust between them, born of necessity, was about to be tested in the fires of conflict and emerge, perhaps, as something unbreakable. Marcus stopped in front of Kevin. The freshman braced himself, his shoulders hunched. Marcus reached into his pocket. Kevin's eyes squeezed shut, expecting a punch. You've witnessed the uneasy alliance between Alara Vance and Marcus Thorne solidify. Forged in the crucible of Julian Hayes' insidious psychological warfare, Julian's relentless attacks, designed to isolate and break them, had instead pushed them closer, transforming Marcus's coerced compliance into a genuine, if still gruff, loyalty. The time for subtle maneuvers was over. It was time for a direct confrontation, a final showdown that would determine the fate of Northwood High's social landscape. You find yourself bracing for the climax, the air thick with anticipation, knowing that a long-simmering conflict is about to erupt. Instead, Marcus pulled out a crumpled wad of bills. He held them out to Kevin, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly. His voice, When it came, was gruff, barely audible, but clear enough in the stunned silence. "Here," he muttered, thrusting the money forward. Your lunch money." Ilara and Marcus had spent days strategizing, piecing together Julian's methods, his network of informants, and the evidence of his manipulations. Ilara, with her sharp mind, had meticulously documented every rumor, every act of sabotage, every instance of emotional torment. Marcus, with his intimate knowledge of the school's undercurrents and Julian's subtle power plays, provided crucial insights into how Julian operated, who his targets were, and how he exploited their fears. They were a formidable team, the quiet strategist and the reformed brute, united by a shared sense of justice and a growing, unspoken trust. Kevin's eyes slowly opened. He stared at the money, then at Marcus, utterly bewildered. He didn't take it. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. Their plan was simple, yet audacious: expose Julian publicly, in a way that would strip him of his power, the power of secrets and manipulation. They decided the school assembly, a mandatory gathering of the entire student body, would be the perfect stage. It was a place where Julian thrived on anonymity and subtle whispers, but it would also be where his tactics would be laid bare for everyone to see. You can almost feel the nervous energy, the quiet determination that settled between them as they finalized their strategy. "Take it," Marcus hissed, a flicker of his old aggression returning, born of sheer discomfort. "It's yours." The day of the assembly arrived, a crisp autumn morning. The gymnasium was packed, a sea of restless students. Julian Hayes sat with his usual smug smirk, his eyes scanning the crowd, seemingly in control. Marcus sat with Ilara, their proximity now less surprising to the student body, but still a source of quiet fascination. He felt a knot in his stomach, a mixture of apprehension and a strange, unfamiliar surge of purpose. He was no longer just protecting his secret, he was fighting for something bigger. Kevin, still in shock, slowly reached out and took the money. He looked at it, then back at Marcus, his brow furrowed in confusion. Principal Thompson began the assembly with routine announcements, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the room. Then Ilara, with a quiet confidence that belied her usual demeanor, raised her hand. Principal Thompson, surprised, acknowledged her. Then came the second part of Ilara's command: the apology. This was even harder. Marcus's pride screamed louder than ever. He clenched his jaw, his eyes darting around the room, desperate for an escape. But Ilara's silent gaze, fixed on him from across the cafeteria, was an unyielding force. "Principal Thompson," Ilara's voice was clear, carrying across the gymnasium. "I need to address something important, something that's been affecting many students here." He took a deep breath, the words catching in his throat. I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice so low it was almost swallowed by the silence. For taking your money. And for bothering you." A ripple of whispers went through the crowd. Julian's smirk tightened, his eyes narrowing. Sensing a challenge, he leaned forward, intrigued. The words hung in the air. Unbelievable. Kevin Miller stared at him, then at the money, then back at Marcus, as if he expected the marauder to suddenly sprout wings. The entire cafeteria was in a state of collective shock. Marcus Thorne had just given back money and apologized. It was unprecedented. It was a seismic shift in the social order of Northwood High. "There's been a pattern of psychological bullying," Ilara continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "Of rumors, of personal information being used to manipulate and control students. And it needs to stop." Marcus, his face burning with humiliation, didn't wait for a response. He spun around and stalked back to his table, his shoulders hunched, his usual swagger completely gone. He slammed back down on the bench, avoiding Ilara's gaze, his face a mask of furious resentment. Julian scoffed, a low, dismissive sound. "What are you talking about, Vance?" he called out, his voice smooth, trying to sound innocent. "Sounds like paranoia to me." Ilara, meanwhile, simply took a bite of her sandwich, a small, almost imperceptible nod of satisfaction on her face. The first command had been obeyed. The marauder had been made to obey her every word. The impossible had happened. Ilara turned her gaze directly to Julian. Her eyes were unwavering, holding a quiet authority that silenced the murmurs. "Is it paranoia, Julian?" she asked, her voice calm. Or is it the truth you're so afraid of? The cafeteria erupted into a cacophony of whispers, excited chatter, and disbelieving murmurs. Students pointed, whispered, and stared at Kevin Miller, who was still clutching his money, looking utterly dazed. The news spread like wildfire through the school. Marcus Thorne had apologized. Marcus Thorne had given back money. Marcus Thorne had been made to do it. She then began to speak, not with accusations, but with facts. She described the pattern of locker vandalism, the lost homework, the anonymous notes, the leaked photos, all without naming names, but painting a clear picture of Julian's methods. She spoke of the fear, the isolation, the psychological toll it took on students. As she spoke, students in the audience began to nod, to exchange glances, a quiet recognition dawning on their faces. They had all, in some way, experienced Julian's insidious tactics. Over the next few days, the impact of this event rippled through Northwood High. Marcus was still Marcus, still intimidating, but there was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in his demeanor. He was more subdued, his gaze less aggressive. He still sat alone at his table, but the force field of fear around him seemed to have weakened. Students still avoided him, but now with a touch of curiosity mixed with their wariness. They wondered what Alara Vance had done, what power she held over him. Julian tried to interrupt, to deflect, to dismiss her as a crazy new kid, but Alara didn't let him. She had prepared. She pulled out a small, discreet flash drive. "I also have evidence," she stated, her voice firm, "of altered files on shared drives, of deleted assignments, and of anonymous threats sent from school computers." She looked directly at Julian. All traceable, with the right access. Ilara, meanwhile, continued her quiet observations. She knew this was just the beginning. Marcus's compliance was born of coercion, not genuine change, but it was a start. She had cracked his armor, and now she had to begin the slow, painstaking process of dismantling it piece by piece. Her plan wasn't just to stop his bullying, it was to redirect his formidable energy, to make him use his strength for something other than cruelty. Julian's face went pale. He hadn't expected her to have concrete evidence, or the technical know-how to acquire it. His composure began to crack. He looked around, suddenly realizing that the room was no longer just a collection of individuals. It was a unified front, their fear slowly turning into anger. A common historical fact, often explored in studies of social change, is that visible acts of defiance or unexpected shifts in power dynamics can have a ripple effect, inspiring others and slowly eroding established norms. Ilara's single act of sitting at Marcus's table, followed by his public, albeit coerced, apology, began to subtly empower other students, showing them that the marauder was not invincible. It's like a tiny crack appearing in a dam. It might not look like much, but it signals a potential for a much larger collapse. "This is ridiculous," Julian blustered, trying to regain control, his voice rising in panic. "She's making it all up. She's just trying to get attention." Ilara began to issue more commands, always subtly, always in private, usually during lunch when she sat at his table. They were never grand, sweeping gestures. They were small, specific actions designed to rectify past wrongs or to prevent new ones. "Marcus, I noticed you tripped Sarah Jensen yesterday. Tomorrow, you're going to pick up her books for her and make sure she gets to class on time." Or, "That new kid, David, looks lost. You're going to show him where the gym is after school." It was at this moment that Marcus Thorne, who had been sitting silently beside Ilara, stood up. His presence was formidable, his shoulders broad, his gaze fixed on Julian. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His very appearance, the former marauder now standing in silent defense of Ilara, sent a powerful message. The students, who had once feared Marcus, now saw him as a protector, a formidable force aligned with justice. Marcus would always resist, his face a storm of resentment and humiliation. "Why should I?" he'd snarl, his voice low. "I don't owe them anything." A common historical fact, often observed in social movements, is that the credibility of a message is significantly amplified when an unexpected or formerly antagonistic figure publicly supports it. Marcus's silent, powerful presence beside Ilara, a visible testament to his transformation, lent immense weight to her accusations, making it impossible for Julian to simply dismiss her as a lone, crazy voice. It's like a medieval dragon, once feared, now standing guard over the innocent. Ilara would simply meet his gaze, her eyes holding that quiet, knowing look. "Your grandmother, Marcus," she would whisper, a gentle reminder of the leash she held. And each time, after a moment of internal struggle, Marcus would grudgingly comply. He'd pick up the books, his movements stiff and awkward, avoiding Sarah's bewildered gaze. He'd point David towards the gym, his words clipped, but undeniably helpful. Julian. Seeing Marcus standing there, his eyes blazing with a cold, controlled fury, felt a true tremor of fear. He had always relied on Marcus's predictability, his explosive anger. But this new, silent, formidable? Marcus was an unknown, terrifying variable. The students began to notice these subtle changes. Marcus was still intimidating, but his actions were becoming less so. He wasn't actively bullying as much. He was still isolated, but the fear around him was slowly dissipating, replaced by a strange, collective curiosity. They saw him perform small, almost imperceptible acts of kindness, disguised by his usual gruff demeanor. And they wondered, "He's lying!" Julian shrieked, his voice cracking, his carefully constructed facade finally crumbling. He pointed a trembling finger at Marcus. "He's just doing whatever she tells him. She's blackmailing him. She knows about his grandmother." A lesser-known detail about the psychology of compliance is that repeated acts of submission, even under duress, can begin to reshape an individual's self-perception. As Marcus was forced to perform acts that contradicted his bully persona, a tiny seed of doubt began to sprout in his own mind about who he truly was. The external actions, however unwillingly performed, started to chip away at his internal identity. It's like being forced to wear a costume long enough that you start to feel like the character. The words, spoken in desperation, hung in the air, revealing Marcus's deepest secret to the entire school. A collective gasp rippled through the gymnasium. Whispers erupted, louder this time, filled with shock and dawning understanding. Marcus's face flushed, a wave of humiliation washing over him. He had known this was a possibility, but the raw exposure still stung. Marcus hated it. He hated Ilara. He hated the feeling of being controlled, of being forced to do things that went against his very nature, but the fear of his secret being exposed, the vulnerability of his grandmother, was a constant, gnawing presence in his mind. He was trapped, bound by Ilara's quiet power. But then, something extraordinary happened. Marcus didn't flinch, he didn't retreat. He looked at Ilara, who met his gaze with a look of profound understanding and unwavering support. Then, he turned back to the crowd, his shoulders squaring. His voice, when it came, was loud, clear, and utterly devoid of shame. He tried to find a way out. He thought about confronting her, about threatening her, but her calm, unwavering gaze, her quiet knowledge, always stopped him. He thought about running away, but where would he go? Who would care for his grandmother? He was caught in a cage of his own making, and Ilara held the key. "Yes," Marcus said, his voice ringing through the gymnasium, silencing the whispers. "She knows about my grandmother. And yes, she made me do things, made me stop being a jerk, made me help people, because she saw something in me that no one else did." He looked directly at Julian, his eyes burning with a righteous anger. "And she's right. You're a coward. Hayes, you hide in the shadows and hurt people because you're too afraid to face them directly. But it stops now." As the days turned into weeks, the first command, then the second, then the third, slowly began to reshape the landscape of Northwood High. The marauder's roar was being replaced by grudging compliance, his reign of terror slowly eroding under the quiet, relentless direction of the new girl. The terrifying, unexpected journey of Marcus Thorne's transformation, forced upon him by a secret he couldn't afford to lose, was now well underway. The stage was set for an unlikely arrangement, where the bully would be made to obey her every word, and perhaps in the process, find a path to redemption he never knew he needed. He took a step towards Julian, his presence overwhelming. Julian, stripped of his secrets, exposed, and facing the combined, unwavering force of Ilara's truth and Marcus's raw, honest power, finally broke. He stumbled backward, his face a mask of terror, and tried to flee, pushing past students, desperate to escape the spotlight. The cafeteria incident, where Marcus Thorne, the marauder, had publicly returned Kevin Miller's lunch money and offered a mumbled apology, sent ripples through Northwood High. The students, bewildered and cautiously optimistic, watched Alara Vance with a new kind of awe. She had, with quiet words and an unyielding gaze, achieved what no teacher, no principal, no student had ever dared. She had made the bully obey. Marcus, for his part, was a simmering cauldron of resentment and humiliation. But the leash Alara held, the secret of his grandmother, was too powerful to break. He was trapped in an unlikely arrangement, forced to dance to her quiet tune. But Marcus was faster. With a swift, powerful movement, he intercepted Julian, not with a punch, but with a firm, unyielding grip on his arm. He didn't hurt him. He simply held him, preventing his escape, his gaze unwavering. "You're not going anywhere, Hayes," Marcus growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Not until everyone hears what you did, and you face the consequences." Over the following weeks, Alara began to subtly direct Marcus's actions. She never issued grand pronouncements or public commands. Their interactions were always quiet, often during lunch at their shared, still isolated table, or in hushed tones in an empty hallway. Her requests were always specific, always seemingly small, and always designed to either rectify a past wrong committed by Marcus or to prevent a new one. "Marcus," she might say, her voice barely a whisper, "I noticed you took David Chen's art supplies last week. He needs them for his project. They're on your locker shelf, aren't they? He'll need them back by tomorrow morning." Principal Thompson, who had been watching the entire exchange with a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension, quickly stepped forward. Security guards moving in to take Julian. The gymnasium erupted in a roar of applause, a collective cheer of relief and triumph. Julian, his face contorted in a mixture of rage and utter defeat, was led away, his reign of terror definitively over. Marcus would glower, his jaw tight. "Why should I?" he'd snarl, his eyes blazing with the familiar defiance. "He can get new ones." A lesser-known detail about the psychology of bullies who are exposed is that their power often relies entirely on secrecy and the fear of exposure. Once their tactics are brought into the light and their victims are empowered to speak out, their influence rapidly crumbles. Julian, stripped of his ability to manipulate from the shadows, became utterly powerless. It's like a medieval sorcerer whose magic only works in the dark, suddenly exposed to the full light of day. Alara would simply meet his gaze, her eyes holding that quiet, knowing look, and her voice would drop to an even softer tone. "Your grandmother, Marcus, is she comfortable? Does she have everything she needs?" The unspoken threat was clear, gentle but firm, and each time, after a moment of internal struggle, his shoulders would slump, and he would grudgingly comply. David Chen would find his art supplies neatly placed on his desk the next morning, Marcus having deposited them there before anyone arrived, his face a mask of furious embarrassment. Marcus stood there, breathing heavily, his shoulders still squared. He looked at Alara, a flicker of something akin to pride and profound relief in his eyes. He had faced his secret, revealed his vulnerability, and used his strength for good. His redemption wasn't just a quiet, internal process. It was a public, undeniable act of courage. The changes were slow, almost imperceptible at first, but they began to accumulate. Marcus, the feared marauder, was still Marcus, but his actions were subtly shifting. He stopped tripping freshmen in the hallways. He no longer extorted lunch money. He still had his intimidating presence, his scowl, his aura of danger. But the active bullying had largely ceased. Instead, he found himself performing strange, almost benevolent acts. Disguised by his usual gruff demeanor, he'd accidentally leave a dropped textbook near its owner, or coincidentally appear when a smaller kid was being harassed by someone else. His mere presence enough to disperse the new threat. The gymnasium slowly quieted, but the atmosphere was electric. The marauder was gone. In his place stood Marcus Thorne, a complex, flawed, but undeniably brave young man who had chosen to stand for what was right. The stage was set for a new dawn at Northwood High, a school transformed by the quiet strength of a transfer student and the unexpected redemption of its fiercest bully. A common historical fact, often observed in social psychology, is that repeated behaviors, even those initially performed under duress, can begin to create new neural pathways and subtly reshape an individual's self-perception. As Marcus was forced to perform acts of kindness, however unwillingly, a tiny seed of doubt about his marauder identity began to sprout. He was still angry, still resentful, but the actions themselves were forcing him to confront a different version of himself. It's like being forced to wear a costume long enough that you start to feel the character's skin. You've witnessed the dramatic climax at Northwood High, the public unveiling of Julian Hayes's insidious tactics, and Marcus Thorne's profound act of courage. The marauder, once a symbol of fear, had shed his skin, revealing a complex, brave young man beneath. Julian, stripped of his power, had been led away, his reign of terror definitively over. Now, you are about to see the aftermath, the quiet transformation of Northwood High, a school forever changed by the unlikely alliance of a poor transfer student and its former bully. You find yourself in a new atmosphere, one of cautious optimism, where the air feels lighter and the shadows have begun to recede. His confusion grew. He hated doing Alara's bidding, hated the feeling of being controlled, but he also noticed the subtle shifts in the school's atmosphere. The fear around him was slowly dissipating. Students still gave him a wide berth, but their glances were now tinged with a strange curiosity. Rather than pure terror, he was still isolated, but the loneliness he had grown accustomed to felt different. Now, less oppressive. He didn't understand why, but the world around him was subtly changing, and Alara Vance was the quiet architect of that change. In the days and weeks following the assembly, the impact of Alara and Marcus's actions was palpable. The fear that had permeated Northwood High for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of collective relief and empowerment. Students who had been silently suffering under Julian's manipulation now felt a newfound courage to speak up, to seek help, and to support each other. The school, once a place of unspoken rules and hidden anxieties, slowly became a more open, safer environment. You could almost feel the collective sigh of relief, the tension draining from the hallways. "Why do you care?" he once snarled at her, during a particularly frustrating lunch where she had suggested he help a new student find his locker. "Why does it matter to you if I'm a jerk?" Julian Hayes, after a thorough investigation by the school administration, was expelled. His parents, confronted with irrefutable evidence of his manipulative and harmful behavior, were forced to acknowledge the severity of his actions. His departure left a void, but it was a healthy void, one that allowed the school community to breathe and heal. Justice, in this instance, had been swift and undeniable. Alara looked up from her sandwich, her gaze calm. "Because it matters to you, Marcus," she replied. Simply, even if you don't want to admit it, and because it makes Northwood High a better place. For everyone, Marcus Thorne, however, faced a different kind of aftermath. His public confession about his grandmother, about Ilara's blackmail, had been a moment of profound vulnerability. He had exposed his deepest shame to the entire school. He braced himself for ridicule, for pity, for the very humiliation he had sought to avoid. But surprisingly, it didn't come. Her words struck a nerve. He scoffed, looking away, but her words lingered. Did it matter to him? He had always told himself it didn't, that he didn't care what anyone thought, but deep down, beneath the layers of anger and resentment, a tiny spark of curiosity, a flicker of something akin to self-reflection, began to stir. Instead, a strange thing happened. Students, who had once feared him, now looked at him with a mixture of awe and respect. They saw not the marauder, but Marcus, a boy who had faced his own demons, revealed his vulnerabilities, and stood up for what was right. The silence around him in the cafeteria was no longer born of fear, but of a quiet, almost reverent curiosity. Some students, tentatively at first, began to approach him, offering a nod, a small smile, or even a quiet, "Good job, Marcus." A lesser-known detail about the power of subtle influence is how it can bypass direct confrontation and appeal to an individual's latent desires or values. Alara wasn't preaching to Marcus. She was simply creating situations where his actions, however coerced, aligned with a more positive outcome. This allowed him to maintain his tough guy facade while subtly performing acts that chipped away at it, slowly exposing the person underneath. It's like trying to get a cat to take medicine by hiding it in its favorite treat. A common historical fact, often observed in social psychology, is that acts of public vulnerability, when met with empathy rather than judgment, can be incredibly powerful in fostering connection and reshaping social perceptions. Marcus's raw honesty, far from destroying him, had instead humanized him, allowing others to see beyond his intimidating facade to the complex, struggling individual beneath. It's like a medieval knight, after years of being a fearsome warrior, suddenly revealing a hidden wound and finding that people respect him more, not less. Marcus began to observe Alara more closely. She was always quiet, always observant. She didn't seek attention or praise for the changes she was orchestrating. She just continued to exist, a calm, unyielding force. He noticed her own simple, clean clothes, the way she sometimes ate only half her lunch, carefully wrapping the rest. He wondered if she, too, had secrets, burdens she carried. The thought was unsettling, yet it created a strange, almost imperceptible bond between them. They were both, in their own ways, outsiders, carrying hidden weights. Marcus, no longer burdened by the need to maintain his marauder persona, slowly began to change in genuine ways. He still had his gruff exterior, his moments of impatience, but the underlying anger that had fueled his bullying began to recede. He started to engage more in classes. His intelligence, which Alara had noted, shining through. He even joined the school's soccer team, channeling his physical energy into something productive, becoming a formidable player. One afternoon, Alara approached Marcus, her expression more serious than usual. "Marcus," she began, her voice low. "There's a new student, Sarah. She's struggling with her math. She needs a tutor, but she's too shy to ask." His relationship with Alara deepened into a quiet, unwavering friendship. They still sat together at lunch, but now it was by choice, a silent acknowledgement of their unique bond. They didn't need words to communicate. A glance, a subtle nod, was often enough. Alara continued to be his quiet confidant, offering subtle guidance, but no longer needing to issue commands. Marcus, in turn, became her steadfast protector, his presence alone enough to deter any lingering negativity. He would still grumble, of course, but his actions spoke louder than his words. Marcus scoffed. "And what, you want me to tutor her? I'm no math whiz." A lesser-known detail about the long-term impact of positive social environments on individuals is how it can foster self-esteem and a sense of belonging, particularly for those who have experienced isolation or trauma. Marcus, finally free from the burden of his secret and the need to bully, began to experience the positive reinforcement of genuine connection, slowly healing the wounds of his past. It's like a medieval fortress, once built for defense, slowly being repurposed into a welcoming community center. "You're actually pretty good at math, Marcus," Alara stated, surprising him. "I've seen your grades, you just don't try in class, and Sarah needs help. She's going to fail if she doesn't get it." She paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "It would really help her. And it would be discreet." Alara, too, found her place at Northwood High. Her quiet strength, her unwavering courage, and her profound empathy had not gone unnoticed. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but her actions had spoken volumes. Students sought her out for advice, for a listening ear, recognizing her innate wisdom and kindness. She became a quiet leader, a beacon of compassion in the transformed school environment. The word discreet caught his attention. It meant his secret wouldn't be exposed. He still hated the idea. But the thought of someone failing, of someone struggling, resonated with a part of him he rarely acknowledged. He remembered the helplessness he felt regarding his grandmother. He remembered struggling himself, in his own way. Marcus's grandmother, with the subtle financial assistance Alara had quietly arranged through a local community outreach program, without Marcus ever knowing the source, began to receive better care. Marcus, still her primary caregiver, found himself with a little more breathing room, a little less overwhelming burden. This small relief, though he didn't know its true origin, allowed him to focus more on school, on soccer, and on building a new life for himself. He grumbled, but a few days later, Sarah Jensen, a shy girl who usually avoided eye contact with anyone, found herself sitting in the library after school with Marcus Thorne, the marauder, grudgingly explaining algebra to her. He was impatient, certainly, But he was also surprisingly clear in his explanations. He even drew diagrams. Sarah, terrified at first, slowly relaxed, realizing he wasn't going to hurt her. She even managed a small, tentative smile when she finally understood a concept. Marcus, for his part, felt a strange, unfamiliar flicker of something in his chest. It wasn't pride, not exactly, but something akin to satisfaction. It was a novel sensation. Historians still debate the long-term impact of individual acts of courage on broader social systems. While a single event might spark change, the sustained transformation often requires ongoing effort and a shift in collective mindset. Northwood High's journey was just beginning, but Ilara and Marcus had laid a powerful foundation for a more empathetic and just community. This remains an open academic question. How do schools and communities sustain positive social change after a major conflict or transformation? Historians still debate the efficacy of restorative justice approaches in addressing bullying, which focus on repairing harm and reintegrating offenders, rather than purely punitive measures. Ilara, unknowingly, was implementing a form of restorative justice, forcing Marcus to actively contribute to the well-being of the community he had once terrorized. This remains an open academic question. How much can an individual's behavior be truly transformed through coerced positive actions versus genuine internal motivation? The story of Ilara Vance and Marcus Thorne became a legend at Northwood High, whispered among new freshmen, a cautionary tale about judging others, and a testament to the power of quiet strength and unexpected redemption. The marauder was gone, replaced by a young man who, through a series of unlikely events and the unwavering belief of one quiet girl, had found his true strength in kindness, not cruelty. The other student, observing these subtle shifts, began to feel a cautious optimism. Marcus was still Marcus, but he was changing. The fear was slowly being replaced by a strange, collective curiosity. They saw him pick up a dropped pencil for a startled freshman, or subtly clear a path for someone struggling with too many books. These were small acts, almost invisible, but they were acts of kindness. Nonetheless, as the school year continued, Northwood High truly became a different place. The fear was gone. The whispers of manipulation had faded. In their place, a sense of community, of mutual respect, began to flourish. Ilara and Marcus, the quiet strategist and the reformed brute, continued their unlikely friendship, their bond a silent reminder that even the darkest shadows can be pierced by a glimmer of humanity, and that sometimes the greatest power lies not in making others obey through fear, but in inspiring them to choose a better path. Marcus continued to resent Ilara's control, but the initial confusion he felt was slowly giving way to a grudging curiosity. He still hated being told what to do, but he couldn't deny the effect his actions were having. The school felt different. He felt different, in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The constant pressure of maintaining his marauder persona was subtly easing, replaced by a new, more complex set of expectations. He was still a bully, but he was also, unwillingly, becoming something else. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more tales of unexpected heroes and hidden strengths, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay with us for the next one, and while you're here, check out our other videos. There's always more to explore. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. As the days turned into weeks, the unlikely arrangement solidified. Ilara, the quiet transfer student, continued to hold the leash, guiding Marcus Thorne with her quiet words and unwavering gaze, and Marcus, the feared marauder, continued to obey, his resentment slowly giving way to a grudging curiosity about this strange girl who saw through his facade and held his deepest secret. The stage was set for a deeper revelation, a glimpse into the troubled past that had forged the marauder, and perhaps the first true steps towards his unexpected redemption.